Welcome to the Intercoin Show. On this episode, we're going to talk about the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank and the wider venture capitalist industry that banked there, the startup industry, talk about centralization versus decentralization, and capitalism at large. Can it be done in a decentralized way by the people and for the people? Let's begin.
I should say the things have changed in some ways.
Who is the determinant of the public interest?
The more time people spend in digital worlds, the more of our lives we live there.
Intercoin, bringing power to the people. So unless you've been living under a rock, you know about Silicon Valley Bank's demise. It's famous because, well, Silicon Valley venture capitalists banked there. Over half of all the venture capitalists in Silicon Valley banked there and told their startups to bank there, which is, by the way, an extremely centralized industry, isn't it? If you all bank at the same bank. And this is the story I want to begin with and cover. So basically, the tech industry consists of large corporations like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, but they all were initially startups. And now these startups are essentially grown, like Y Combinator is a startup, the most famous startup accelerator. Twice a year, they give $500,000 per company to a large number of startups. These startups then go on to be, if they're successful, acqui-hired by Google, Facebook, Microsoft, etc. So it's kind of feeding the centralized system. Okay. Now, Google, Microsoft, and so on don't just bank at Silicon Valley Bank. However, all of these people do. And when it came time to bail them out, they certainly turned to the government to ask for it. So, for example, government, talking about the Twitter files, a lot of these centralized companies like Twitter do, in fact, work with the government because their target is very simple to look at and where they are. And so the government can go ahead and sort of work with them to see what happens. Guys like Matt Taibbi, who exposes them, are then hauled into Congress, which is a part of the government, and then interrogated as to why or what they're doing to expose all this. So, Matt Taibbi famously wrote things like, "Why isn't Wall Street in jail?" This is on the East Coast. Back when the previous collapse, no one actually was specifically responsible or had to pay many consequences for this. The banks were bailed out back then. But what I want to notice is that the government is working with the big corporations, whether it's big tech or whether it's Wall Street, or bailing them out one way or another way, or simply colluding. And so we, the individuals, we the people need our own platform. So on this show, I often talk about the revolution of how I build a social networking operating system over here, qbix. And you can see here, all of it. You could go to qbix.com, become a developer, join the growing ecosystem. And this year, you're going to start hearing about it right here. Another thing is, of course, Intercoin, which you're right now on the site, and you're probably watching. So Intercoin is the Web3 operating system by the people and for the people. Now, it always was supposed to be this way. And in fact, Web3 represents a sort of bottom-up revolution against the sort of capitalist, corporatist, centralized industry. I talk about the venture capitalists because we're going to delve into corporatism, which anarcho-capitalists and Ron Paul and others rightly say corporatism is bad. It's essentially centralized, crony capitalism. And we're going to talk about how a lot of capitalism leads to that, because as they amass capital, then they go and get lobbyists and they try to collude with other sources of capital, in this case, political capital, in order to get things done. Let's look at a typical example here. We got Medicare Part D. Okay, Medicare Part D was, in fact, put together as part of the Medicare Modernization Act of 2003. Okay, but here's the interesting thing is, they were not, it was written primarily by the actual pharma industry that they were supposed to, in fact, regulate. So look at what got into the bill. The federal government is not permitted to negotiate Part D drug prices with drug companies. So like insulin, for example, you may praise Trump, some of you, for lowering insulin prices by intervening in the market. But in fact, this market problem wouldn't even exist if the government represented the people and didn't just allow all these pharma companies to help influence the bill. Now, it turns out that now let's take a look at who actually helped pass this bill back in the day. We've got here former Congressman Billy Tauzin, a Republican who steered the bill through the House, retired soon after, and took a $2 million a year job as president of Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, PHRMA, the main industry lobbying group in Washington. Medicare boss. This is the guy running Medicare, Thomas Scully, who threatened to fire Medicare chief actuary Richard Foster if he reported how much the bill would actually cost, was negotiating for a new job as a pharmaceutical lobbyist as the bill was working through Congress. Oh, conflict of interest much? So 14 congressional aides quit their jobs to work for related lobbies immediately after the bill's passage. You look at these things, you look at the 60 Minutes report, which is, I guess, not there now, CBS News. Basically, things like reports on drug lobbyists' role in passing the bill that keeps drug prices high. Okay, I mean, literally, it basically said that Medicare is not permitted to negotiate these drug prices. So here we have an industry that essentially is a revolving door. It is captured, it's called regulatory capture, right? Regulatory capture. And this happens in more than the pharma industry. The point is, the pharma industry obviously works with the government, not just during times of a pandemic where they tell everyone that they have to get a vaccine, otherwise they could lose their job, and government jobs and so on. Not just that, but they actually write the bills. And this is a problem, isn't it? Government is supposed to represent the people. And so if we're going to have government do anything, it is supposed to negotiate in the interest of the people against the corporate interests, so to speak. But of course, the corporate interests have a lot of money, they're moneyed interests, and so they can buy a lot of clout. So going back to Silicon Valley Bank. So the first bank to go under wasn't Silicon Valley. In fact, it was Silvergate. But Silvergate Bank didn't have very many venture capitalists banking there, so it didn't get as much fanfare. Of course, it was also the first. You could say the second one is a bigger one. It shows a contagion. But of course, the regulators got in there, basically. Now, they got in there and they were called by the state of California, basically called in the FDIC to take over. Now, what happens when the FDIC takes over a bank? Let's look at that. Takes over a bank. You can look at the video of what happens. Here's video. Your bank has failed. What happens next? They have this nice little video that they show. Here's what happened back in 2008.
A lot of people are worried about their bank these days. While devastated giants like Citigroup get bailed out again and again and again, many smaller banks are failing. The federal agency that takes over unsound banks is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the same people who guarantee that depositors won't lose their money.
And so let's talk about the FDIC. We're currently talking about lifting the cap on the FDIC. Just today, Warren says a proposal has got to be on the table right now. So we're talking about creating, increasing the cap. Okay. Incidentally, they also talked about increasing cap on Social Security. We're talking about the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Social Security is one of the most regressive taxes on the books because, of course, the people making under $250,000 are the ones who are paying it. And then after $250,000, I think it's, I forgot exactly what the cutoff is today, but at some point you don't have to pay it anymore, right? So the people under that pay it. People who make over that no longer pay anymore over that cap. So that is talking about the cap on taking money in. Here, we're talking about lifting a cap on putting money out. The thing about doing this is that it's just fiddling around the edges. So what? You make people whole up to $500,000, but you don't necessarily fix the underlying problem. Yes, we want the banks to put money into insurance because that promotes stability, right? So now they have to pay larger premiums in order to promote stability. So this is a mechanism that will, in fact, make more people whole for larger amounts, right? But what do you think is going to happen in the wake of this debacle? What is going to happen is essentially that once the bank fails like this, and the FDIC insures every account up to 250,000, what's going to happen is everyone is going to now try to decentralize. Okay, they're going to try to get their accounts in many, many banks. And so everyone now is going to bank at many banks, which is a good thing, by the way. Decentralizing things reduces the risk of failure, that one single point of failure, right? Which was this bank. But again, the culture that led to this, why does it lead to this? It's because the Silicon Valley culture essentially takes these startups, like I've been saying, Y Combinator basically takes startups. Let's look at what they do, right? They basically take these people around the country and sometimes around the world, fly them in and get them to pair up and actually, well, they're already paired up. You're already supposed to have some traction, of course. But the point is then they invest this much money and they create this culture. And what is that culture? It's very similar to the American dream, right? And this is awesome. Like a lot of people this is capitalism on the one hand, but the thing is, it is so centralized, so centralized. Who is this? Is this Elizabeth Holmes? Let's take a look. Elizabeth Holmes. Okay, I'm not sure, but I think that's her. Well, if that is her, then basically there's this venture capitalists are sort of herd animals. They're sort of all piling on the same deal. And that's a problem, of course, because that is, again, centralization. It becomes sort of an old boys club. And while they can celebrate more women in the club now, it's still a club and you ain't in it. Okay, it's a big club, you ain't in it. And you know, they sometimes give a slap on the wrist, sometimes very rarely something happens. Look at I'm going to talk about the mentality and how Web3 is different. So whether it's Theranos, which is an outright fraud or scam that said they could do things they couldn't, or whether it's something like WeWork, for example, with Adam Newman, VCs tend to essentially pour money into the startups which have money losing economics, and then eventually go IPO and put them in the market. So for example, SoftBank lost, and to their credit, they lost their own money, right, doing this. But the people running these companies get a ton of money. So the venture capital industry, to its credit, although it props up money-losing economics, they call it removing friction, right? They say that essentially, don't charge your customers until you get big. Don't worry about it. We're going to give you $5 million rounds, $15 million rounds, $50, $100 million rounds. They all come together. At the end of the day, it's the public that pays in the form of an IPO, right? What is an IPO? Well, essentially, it's an initial public offering where they exit. Right? They've taken the company to the point where the public can now own the company. And you might think, oh, nice. This is collective ownership of the means of production, right? The dream of Karl Marx and everything. Basically, an idea that the people will collectively own the means of production. Well, of course, the means of production are owned by corporations. And if the corporations are owned by the public at large, isn't that essentially publicly owning the means of production? Well, yes, in one way it is. The public, in fact, owns shares in these corporations. It's better than socialism of Karl Marx because you can own shares in any corporation, not just your factory. But the problem is that essentially Americans at large only own about 6% of all stocks on Wall Street, 6% owned by regular people on Wall Street. And I can't find it right now, but essentially your grandma and everyone together, this is basically what okay, the rest is owned in a sort of Ouroboros of eating its own tail, where they sit on each other's boards. So like, for example, Eric Schmidt of Google sits on the boards of other companies, right? And pension funds sit on the boards of these companies, and they sit on each other's boards. So at the end of the day, the control of what the companies decide to do or not do is in fact in the hands of these companies. I write about this all the time. Also on my blog, or maggershack.com/blog. I talk about essentially how whether it's how there's either cartels or collusion, or it happens organically. I'm going to talk about government and industry together. Just to give you one example, Google, Apple cartel in hiring. This was a alleged hiring conspiracy, which led to antitrust litigation, and finally Google and Apple settled this litigation. What it was is basically they agreed not to poach each other's employees. The government said, well, that is an antitrust issue, and to its credit, threatened to get involved and do something about it. So they essentially had to settle. Similarly, Apple was hit with antitrust lawsuits around its handling with developers. But you see these big companies like Amazon, for example, how they treat people in warehouses. I mean, this is clear. Like if you get a job at a warehouse, you can't get a bathroom break. Like you literally, some people have to skip bathroom breaks in order to make the quota. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is as close to wage slavery in its pure definition as you can think. Now they're being mercifully replaced with robots. So robots is something which is going to be a big issue coming up because, of course, we have automation. And so we've got people like Andrew Yang who talk about what we can do going forward. Here's an example.
Yes, in this new series called Future We Want. And before we delve deeper into your ideas about how to create a more sustainable and equitable future, I want to start off by talking about the present. Do you see a way forward?
You would ideally resolve it through changes in political leadership, and then those new leaders would enact certain policies.
See, I don't necessarily believe in this kind of stuff because, first of all, I'm not in politics, okay? So obviously I'm not an expert in these things and going through the political machine like Andrew, who has to repeat the same thing over and over like a bad comedian. Basically, if a joke hits, you have to keep repeating it. If your politician, it's the same deal, right? I would get tired of saying the same thing over and over. That's why I record these things. That's why I write them down. So you could clip it and you can reshare it. I don't have to say it over and over and over. Although I do evolve my narrative and, it's constantly reinforced because I do talk to anarcho-capitalists. I do talk to conservatives, and I talk to liberals and progressives and others. And I could tell you that across the political spectrum, it makes sense to have these reforms. Unfortunately, these reforms are not going to come from government. As a libertarian, I can tell you, Andrew Yang gave it a good college try. He got in there. He got what, 2% of the vote? I don't know. Andrew Yang primary percentage vote. Let's see. That's just the primary, not even in the general election. How much did he get? If he ran third party, I'm saying how much would he have gotten? Okay, so in one area in New York, he appeared here in New York, and he got a lot of 22% of likely Democratic voters, which you would think is like amazing. But this is him running for mayor. Running for mayor. So it's a little bit different. Okay, and he still lost, by the way. But he didn't get to implement his tiny UBI, which was going to be a $5 a month or something. Well, it's nice to have at least something. The public isn't ready for this kind of thing through the political process. If you look at the Democratic primary before 2021, before whatever, let's say like that. What was it? How much did he get? I'm just going to go out and say about 4%. And again, I could be wrong about this. Okay. My point is trying to get through the process. Oh, here we go. Democratic primary results. Okay. So come on, really? Department of Elections, Virginia, they take it off. Okay. Let's try this. Here we go. Andrew Yang. Okay. Andrew Yang. How much did he get? What's this, 0? What is this? Contests 1, 0. Okay. Let's sort by popular vote. Oh, they got Bernie Sanders in there, of course, but he didn't win. Okay. We got Andrew Yang, 0.45%. What? Okay, so compared to this guy with 26%, and still didn't win because it's not a democratic, totally democracy. And then Tulsi Gabbard scored slightly higher than Andrew Yang, also an independent. Tom Steyer, wow, he scored higher than Andrew Yang. I'm surprised, actually. He just entered the race at the last minute. So yeah, Andrew Yang, he tried to reform. And so you don't go through government. Bernie Sanders has been trying to do this for years. Ron Paul has been trying to do it for years. Did I say years? Decades. None of those guys were able to do a lot through the government. Bernie Sanders arguably is called the Amendment King. He was able to pass a bunch of amendments. Rolling Stone called him the Amendment King because he was able to pass more roll call amendments than any other congressman. And so basically, he was able to do things like the War Powers Resolution together with Rand Paul, audit the Fed together with Ron Paul. You see, whenever they team up, they're able to do things together. So because they're not so partisan, they're able to work across party lines. They're not quite, part of their party. But again, even though you could tell I'm a fan of Bernie Sanders and I'm a fan of Ron Paul, I think that government will not rein in these things. The most it can do is sort of insure things. I prefer that it pay for that insurance using tax on negative externalities, which does not do at all, pretty much very little. With carbon credits, maybe a little bit, but it never passes things like, for example, the carbon tax and dividend. It's a bipartisan thing that could be passed if they wanted to. It never actually goes into this. So carbon tax and dividend is the idea that, hey, why don't we actually tax negative externalities at the point of extraction or at the point of emission or whatever, and then use that money to fund a dividend for the people, UBI. The only state that actually does this is Alaska, and they have the Alaska Permanent Fund funded exactly this way. So essentially it comes from the point of view of, hey, basically, we're going to give each person the revenues from taxing the fossil fuels extracted in our state. Their point of view is like, it's our fossil fuels, it's on our land, you extract it, corporations, you give us a cut, and we're going to give it to all the people. So they come at it from a point of view of ownership, not necessarily environmentalism or negative externalities, but at the end it's pretty cool. I mean, if you look at how much they pay out $3,284 per year. And what does that do? Well, the Genie coefficient of Alaska has been the highest pretty much in every year. Let's look at this Genie coefficient test income inequality. So if you look at income inequality and you look at Alaska, let's actually sort it by inequality. Okay, by families. Genie coefficient. Okay, here we go. So Utah is at the top. It's consistently has the lowest Genie coefficient, meaning the lowest inequality. And Utah has housing for the homeless and just give them a home and so on. So anytime you have stuff like that, it sort of brings up the bottom. Alaska used to be near the top. I guess it's in the top 5 these days. If you looked at okay, 2019, but normally in those years it was near the top. And so perhaps one reason for that is their UBI. Certainly it does not hurt income inequality, as you could see, as opposed to something like this where the have-nots need to work for a corporation. And don't you think they could have picked a better corporation if they could have? Do you think they want to work as wage slaves? So obviously they do it because that's what's available for many of them. Okay, this idea that everyone can save themselves by their bootstraps and go to another town is kind of silly. And that's why the people who voted for Trump, the people who didn't want to move out of their cities, for example, in the Rust Belt, although that's not the only thing, there's also mining towns and others, they voted for a person like Trump. They also would have voted for a person like Bernie, because these people give them hope. They give them hope that they don't have to move, like in Grapes of Wrath, where they had to move to the cities, and then the cities would try to create jobs for them. And it took 10 years to build up a new industry. So, Donald Trump simply tells them, well, we're just going to go back to coal and we're going to revitalize your towns, perhaps. And Bernie Sanders talks about how, we're going to bring the jobs, the money back to America. These corporations are not going to be able to offshore their money. But what's more important is that everyone is going to get a safety net. Donald Trump promised this too when he said famously, I'm going to take care of everybody. But everybody, Donald Trump, in 60 Minutes, Okay, Medicare for all 60 minutes. This is when he ran for president. These were his promises. Here we go. Let me see if I can, in fact, find this. Here he is, and he's talking about we got to take care of everybody, and who's going to pay for it? Well, we're going to pay. We're going to make so much money on the other side, as he says. Okay, Donald Trump, healthcare 60 minutes. Did I have a short clip? I don't see it here. Unfortunately, I can't get it for you immediately. But the point is, he said, we're going to take care of everybody. And so how are you going to pay for it? He says, well, the government's going to pay for it, but we're going to get so much on the other side. I'm quoting literally what he said. The thing is, government is maybe good for that kind of thing. It's good for creating safety nets. It is not good for being trusted to rein in these corporations. So just take a look at some of these examples, okay? So we have here, government and industry distract us from solving systemic problems. I wrote this piece. Look, a lot of libertarians are anarcho-capitalists, and they believe there's nothing wrong with capitalism. And in fact, it's the government and its socialist ways that are the root of all problems. But here's the thing, is that the government actually helps the capitalists, the corporatists. So what happens is that the capitalism, like the venture capitalists of Silicon Valley, build up these startups, and they get these startups to be bigger and bigger, and then eventually acqui-hired and feed the machine of Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon, and so on, and they acqui-hire these companies, so you just get bigger and bigger. It's very hard for a small startup to compete with Apple with all its patents and everything. So it tends to build these big corporations, then these big corporations get all this capital, and they get all these lobbyists, and then they go ahead and lobby government. So let's see, big tech lobbying. Billions. How much did they spend on lobbying? And here we go, last year. Probably quite a bit. And we're going to talk about FTX, and we're going to talk about special parts of the tech sector, which are co-opting movements like Web3 and making people think that you know, they are Web3 when in fact they are not decentralized at all. So anyway, here we go. Google is probably one of the largest lobbyists, but if you look at all of the companies lobbying, what are they doing? For this small amount of money, they want to get political favors. But let's look at the larger picture of what's going on when government works with industry. So let's look at, for example, processed foods and GMO. Okay, so we've got the government enforcing patents of Monsanto and others, right? That's one thing. Also, the government is overseeing an industry that puts highly processed sugars and starches into foods, genetically engineers all these things. And also we get high fructose corn syrup we put into everything. Let's look at what's going on here. Obesity rate in the United States, obesity among children even, obesity and also diabetes among children. The rate, what's the rate? I wish Google would, I need ChatGPT for this show. 1 out of 6 children is obese and 1 out of 3 is overweight or obese. This is this country. How does that happen? Oh, the kids don't run around anymore? No, they don't, because of the government schools, which I'll get into for a second. But let's now look at diabetes. It should be insane. Diabetes is not a childhood disease normally. But now we see that, well, actually, it's not as big as I thought. Only 0.35% of the population has it. But I would still say that it's an increase from before. I will have to say it's not as bad as the 1 in 3 for obesity, but let's just look at is diabetes becoming more common in children? Typically, well, it becomes more common when they become adults. The increasing number of children with diabetes has led to more cases. Yeah, but how many more? Concerning increases in youth diabetes. Here's the thing is, let's just go to the surges. Type 1 diabetes surges, while type 2 diabetes skyrockets, okay? Youth, we're talking about maybe not children, maybe teenagers, adults. Again, how much is this tied to this? We don't know because the government is not really volunteering to help out with the situation. In fact, it works with these companies. Now let's look at antibiotics for animals. This happens with factory farms. Okay. Oh yeah. So what is the public told about the diabetes? What are they told about the obesity? Just go ahead and exercise, right? Diet and exercise. The individual can solve the problem that is caused upstream by the government working together with the companies to plant and to put stuff. I mean, put sugar and everything. Like, take a look at this: zoo animals, sugar, fruits. It's gotten to a point where the zoo weans animals off of fruit because it's increased sugar. They can't have that much sugar. Humans have bred fruits so sweet, the zoo had to stop feeding them to some animals. This is normal. I think any reasonable person would say, perhaps the government and industry should work in the interest of the people. But of course, the system makes them work in other ways, which is it optimizes for profit, which I'll talk about. Factory farming. Oh my God, this is so egregious. Okay, we've got here the factory farming industry essentially transforms nearly all farms into factory farms. Okay, because again, in the capitalist market competition, the average hamburger could be a little cheaper, right? A farm that makes things cheaper, makes more things, is obviously more capable and has better fitness for selecting it in the capitalist system, the market system. That makes sense. What market mechanism would you use to end factory farms? Go ahead, tell me in the comments below. Seriously, it's not something you can solve with more market system, and perhaps not with more government. Because if you look at this, billions of animals are raised in appalling conditions. Go to meat.org, and you could see Paul McCartney showing you when people were still able to record this kind of stuff. They can't spread a single wing. They sit in these cages, and their beaks are cut off, so they can't necessarily peck each other because they're living in their own dung. Look at this. They're showing they can't walk. I mean, these are animals that are held indoors
shortly after birth, which causes both of them profound distress.
You see this. So I don't even want to show you that much, but my point is this: you could become a vegan, but it's not going to solve the problem upstream. So again, people are told, become a vegan, you live longer. And look, yes, vegans and vegetarians live on average 10 years longer, and that is huge. That's a huge difference. A team of researchers in the United States has shown vegetarian men live for an average of 10 years longer than non-vegetarian men. Switching to a plant-based diet can add 10 years to life. I mean, you're talking about longevity. There you go. I don't know if it's calorie restriction or just removing the carcinogens from grilling meat or whatever. Yes, it is a worthy lifestyle, but again, we can't do it. We can't fix the upstream problem with downstream solutions. So while people are told, exercise consumer choice, go vegan, you could change the world, okay? The fact is, this is not your grandmother's farming industry. People are used to having cheap meat, and there's billions of people now in the world. So the only way they could do this is essentially to have some sort of mechanism to rein in factory farming. But instead, what does the government do? Well, the government bans videotaping factory farms abuses. Seriously, ag-gag laws. Can you believe this? So instead of being on the side of the animal and the cruelty to animals, instead of the side of the individuals, the people they're supposed to represent, the government is on the side of the factory farms. Several states have passed, many considered to pass so-called ag-gag laws, which criminalize the undercover investigations that reveal abuses on farms. They do this with Julian Assange. They do this also with, basically exposing any sort of abuse, even of humans, maybe in Guantanamo or other places, or spying on you with PRISM or whatever. Obviously, the government doesn't want its own abuses to be revealed, but they do want to know what you're doing with your $600. So that's just an example. They want to go after your bank transactions, $600 reporting requirement. I say, sure, you can have our $600 transactions information if we can have your transparent government negotiations. what have you been doing to prevent the war in Yemen? What have you been doing to end it? What have you been doing to prevent the war in Ukraine? What have you been doing to end it? Because it sounds like sometimes these backdoor conversations are revealed later, and it's appalling. I'll just show you two of them. One of them is Naftali Bennett admits U.S. bloc peace agreement. Okay, so this is, and then he walked it back, just like everybody else, like the 30 progressives, they walked it back. But the first thing is when they give the all, open interview, everything's on the table. This is what happens. I mean, basically, he said things like wide-ranging interview. He says he got concessions from Putin. He got concessions from Zelensky. Both sides were huge steps, he thought. His impression were both sides very much wanted a ceasefire. Think about that. This was days after the invasion, and he described both of them as being very pragmatic. What happened? I happened to speak to one of the negotiators on Facebook, so I know that the negotiators were not really coming at it in good faith. You could see that they were venue shopping for many days as the convoy was coming towards Kiev. And unlike the war between Russia and Georgia, which I need to bring this up for a second, because this is an example of a successful end to the war. A similar war happened with the same exact things, two breakaway republics, NATO, Georgia, the Black Sea, everything was pretty much the same. And so these, Georgia declared its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. Amid this backdrop, these republics wanted their own independence. They didn't get it. Georgia was fighting with South Ossetia and Abkhazia, but look what happened at the end of the day. What happened is, here, Sarkozy personally, Nicolas Sarkozy, president of France, personally negotiated a ceasefire on the 12th of August, okay? And the war only started on the 1st of August. Russian-backed South Ossetian forces started shelling the Georgian villages, and then the Georgian peacekeepers and others started fighting back, intensifying artillery attacks, started to put an end to these attacks. Georgian army units were sent into the South Ossetian conflict zone, and then some Russian troops had crossed the border already into South Ossetia, and they launched a full. So what happened was Russia falsely accused Georgia of committing genocide and aggression against the South Ossetia, very similar to the Ukraine war. It launched a full-scale land, air, and sea invasion of Georgia, including its undisputed territory, referring to it as a peace enforcement operation, meaning stop firing on these people. Well, here's what we know. We know that it ended very quickly, similar to how when NATO bombed Yugoslavia, it ended, well, not so quickly, it ended in a few months, and unfortunately ended the lives of over 500 civilians, but mercifully ended. And again, Kosovo in this case was the breakaway republic, and Kosovo Albanians were essentially the people that NATO said were being genocided, and therefore look what happened: decentralization. They were able to have their autonomy, and peacekeeper was stationed, in this case NATO peacekeepers, and in this case Russian peacekeepers. The point being that the conflict ended. This particular conflict here, we have essentially, according to Naftali Bennett, huge steps for either side. Both sides very much wanted a ceasefire, pragmatic, and yet he said, recounting how Western leaders responded to what did they have to do with this bilateral agreement? Well, from the side, they say UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson advocated for more radical measures, and while Macron and German Chancellor were more pragmatic, Biden said supported both approaches. So as we can expect, we saw that Germany and France very much wanted to broker a peace, just like they have been doing with the Normandy format for years. They were bringing together the Russian president and the Ukrainian president, and you could see here, it was they were at the table like this. They were negotiating. Here's the Russian president. Here is Zelensky, right? The Ukrainian president. Here is Macron, and here is Angela Merkel. And so they all try to do this. Now, they tried to do this back since 2014, and they drew a pretty good agreements in Belarus. In fact, it was called the Minsk agreements, but they're only called Minsk. But in fact, they met in Normandy, in Paris, and many different places. The French hosted this, and they tried to make a solution. We have here Hollande, Francois Hollande. We got Angela Merkel. We got Angela Merkel again and again. And then finally, we have Olaf Scholz. We got here Macron, Macron, Macron. We've got here, of course, Putin, 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 Putin. And we've got Poroshenko, Poroshenko, Zelensky, Zelensky. These governments seem to fail at essentially getting these peace agreements. And everyone blames Putin. Of course, everyone blames Russia. I can understand that. But you could also see Zelensky admits Minsk too. He was never going to implement. He never intended to implement Minsk too. To me, that's a huge problem. Thanks credit for derailing Minsk agreement. I mean, these are some, reasonable shows like The Hill Rising or whatever. You could watch it yourself. Again, these governments are not negotiating in good faith, but then they say we must fight, and then they send you, the individual, to go fight a war. And if you Yemen revolution. Now, if you look at 12 years later, what's going on? Again, same thing. Once you have the uprising, 10 years after uprising, Yemen lies fractured. And of course, millions are starving because of a blockade, because they live in the desert. Okay, and Saudis have blockaded the entire country. Okay, this is how the Arab Spring gave hope to the people. And then, of course, what happened was a proxy war, this time between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they tore apart the country with these rival gangs. So it's just, okay. So what I'm trying to say is that governments are not going to help. I hope you understand. This is what I'm trying to say. So when it comes to factory farms, I don't expect governments to be easy to use that apparatus. When it comes to processed foods and GMO, I don't see that necessarily. Let's move on. Plastic containers, okay? So beer companies still use glass, but companies like Coca-Cola and Snapple have switched from glass to plastic. Why? Because it's cheaper. It's also like lighter for transportation and so on. But the materials are not biodegradable. So what that means is, of course, they'll stay in the environment and they'll find their way into your water and everything else. So you see, this is called negative externalities. These are the things the government should be very happy to tax. And the people who are affected many years later downstream should understand to tie that effect to what they can do upstream. It's companies like Coca-Cola and Snapple that are supposed to be taxed so that they can switch to non-biodegradable plastic. It's not supposed to, to switch off of non-biodegradable plastic. They have these millions of dollars. They can research containers that actually biodegrade, okay? Like milk goes in these cartons, right? What's wrong with that? But it's egregious. It's gotten to the point where the public supports this kind of stuff. The public doesn't want to even wash a spoon. It will rather take a plastic spoon that's shipped from China or whatever, that's plastic. So it stays in the environment. And what's the individual told? Well, by the way, also the clothing companies with polyester and other plastics, instead of researching and switching to something else, okay, like they used to have cotton, they used to have a lot of things. And of course, it's much easier for them to have these properties, these stretchy fabrics, fine. But what's the cost when your washing machine just flushes it down? Of course, it gets into everywhere, builds up, where now we find plastic particles, even in the most pristine waters. This is crazy. Plastic in the pristine waters of anywhere in the world, really, at this point. Microplastics found in pretty much every pristine water of everything. Why pristine lakes are filled with toxins. You name it. This is what we're causing our environment. And again, what is the individual told? The individual is always told that you should not use plastic straws. You should not use plastic bags, whereas the companies can totally use plastic. Kind of crazy, isn't it? They're distracting you. And that's the point of my thing, is they're distracting you from solving systemic problems, getting together. How do they distract you? Well, they distract you by pitting black versus white, male versus female. For example, red pill. you got the red pill, men versus women, you know, this movement, right? And so okay, they go attack each other. Both make good points. Red pillars make some points about women, they have privilege. Feminists make points about men, that they have privilege. Guess what? Everyone has some privilege, okay? Obviously, men, you know, for example, it's obvious what privilege is. Men have, they're bigger, they're stronger, they could go out at night. They don't have to worry about getting raped so much, except if they're in prison. But on the other hand, what you see is women have a lot of privileges too. Like men have to make them make the money, take care of them, make more money than them, pay for the first date, make the first move, risk their dignity, risk their be shot down. Men have to, you know, buy cars. Men also take more risks. More men are homeless. More men go to war when there's a war. Like, for example, what's happening in Ukraine and Yemen. Obviously, it would be silly and foolish to waste women on this war, but they waste men. Men are expendable. So yes, like men and women enjoy different things. And if you go to a niche thing like a club, you'll see that very well, right? Men told to buy $300 bottle service and go to a table. Women, if they look good, get in for free. Not all women. There are women and men who are not considered very attractive by most of the opposite sex. This tends to be very overweight women, for example, and very short men. For the most part, women are attracted to height, men are attracted to women who weigh less than them, and so on. But the thing is that, you know, their entire industries that cater to women free, men have to pay. If this was black and white and it said, you know, white people get in for free, black people have to pay, you know, or vice versa, it would be racist, right? But here is a legitimate business purpose, so it's given a pass. It's interesting. Anyway, my point is they pit you against each other. Yes, these things are true. Everyone has some advantages and disadvantages and so on. But what they're doing is they're making it so that you don't necessarily get together. The public is told to recycle, and that was mandated, in fact. But it turns out that it's largely a scam. So here's NPR talking about China shipping things to China. That's recycling. Oh, China's going to do it. They didn't do it. They dumped it into the rivers. China dumps plastic into rivers. I mean, this is a scam. This is Yangtze deposits. I mean, here. Once we I mean, you can't make this up as a Chinese government, okay? These are people being affected by this. Plastic washes up on shores of island. Every day, these islanders come and they try to get this plastic. 38 million pieces of trash. And this is not even the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. This is like, oh, I forgot about that even. So most densely populated, okay, insane. And all these ads, which 26 seconds, I'm not going to wait. Sorry, capitalism, I'm not going to wait for these ads to show you this. Plastic on these beaches, all these things, okay. And of course, there's a Great Pacific Garbage Patch. What do you think is all in common in here? Is that the government gives these companies a free pass. They're telling them, go ahead, make these plastic containers, all you want. And then a lot of it is also fishing nets and other things, which, to be fair, is smaller businesses. But I mean, ridiculous. Look,
plastic pollution is one of the biggest threats the oceans face today. But how much do we really know about it? On its mission to solve this problem, the Ocean Cleanup just published the most advanced research ever on the Great Pacific Garbage Patch.
You can go read it yourself. I think by 2050, there will be more plastic than fish in the oceans. What? I mean, what? So biology, nature, we say we can't affect nature as much. A lot of people say we shouldn't do anything about fossil fuels and the greenhouse effect, which is a subject of another video. Plastic waste in the ocean will, by mass, be more than the fish. So nature, with all of her glory of making all the fish in these oceans that we don't really touch very much, except we do overfishing in our coasts, but like all the oceans with all the fish being like born and hatching from the caviar and everything, we're going to produce more plastic as humanity. So yes, we can definitely rival nature in the mass, the biomass in this case on the one hand, and the plastic mass on the other hand. Luckily for us, nature has in fact evolved bacteria that eat plastic, and it lives in the guts of some worms now, and so on. So perhaps we will unleash this bacterium in the oceans, and guess what? We'll probably have unintended consequences because we as humans basically have destroyed. This is what we have done. We've turned the entire planet into essentially monocultures and farms. So if we do biomass of chickens, cows, and humans versus like all other animals, right? Livestock such as cows, chickens, pigs are 630 million tons of biomass. Humans are 390 million tons of biomass, while everything else, wildlife, mammals, we're not talking about insects here, or algae or bacteria, just insects, just mammals, 60 million tons. So all those tigers and bears and little critters and the rabbits and the squirrels and whatever, humans and livestock make up 94% of the entire mammal biomass. And you're telling me we cannot have an effect on this planet? We've cut down the forests. And this is the mammal biomass. Look at all the forests we've cut down. Forests cut down around the world. Okay, the deforestation, mind-boggling statistics. Forests still cover about 30% of the world's area, but they're disappearing at an alarming rate. You could go read this for yourself. The deforestation. Okay, so basically 90% of the rainforest has been destroyed and logging is spreading. I mean, don't you think it's going to, okay, we're going to take the 90%, we're not going to stop there. It's going to go to 1%. What good is 1%? So the oxygen is not in danger. Okay, oxygen is going to be there, but how are we going to remove the carbon? So hopefully nature will reforestate, and in fact it does. If you look at North Pole now, poles are becoming greener. That's the only good news about it, is that nature gets trees growing at other things. The Arctic is getting greener. That's bad news for all of us. I'm not quite sure it's bad news so much. I'm not much into the global warming alarmism, because I think that simply we'll go to a period, another equilibrium where we'll simply, yes, the equator will become uninhabitable, but then we'll move towards the poles where, you know, we'll essentially have a kind of environment which existed in Earth's history. But the speed at which we're doing it is very alarming. But the idea is that there will be more trees, right, at higher altitudes. What's more alarming is that bees and insects are disappearing. And again, we're talking about worldwide. They're disappearing at an alarming rate. Okay, and they tell you that commercial bees are making a comeback. Well, great. With great effort, we are saving commercial bees. Nice. But these are pollinating everything. The biomass of insects happens to be huge. And if it's shrinking, that is the bottom of the food chain for birds. And then the birds are going to disappear. And this is the sound of the planet slowly dying. You can't just have chickens and cows. And one last thing, soil, desertification around the world. So 1/3 of all arable soil is severely degraded, and fertile soil is being lost at a rate of 24 billion tons a year. It affects 1/3 of the planet. So there's now going to be arid conditions in water, and something called day zero in cities around the world. Day zero, 11 cities may run out of drinking water. That's in 2018. If you look at after 2021, we in fact have water crisis. One big one is Cape Town. All right, maybe it's still 11 cities. I mean, it's crazy. They're draining their aquifers. What's going on? It's a combination of climate change, but also there's not enough. We're not reforesting. We need to reforestate. We need to turn deserts into a bloom. Like, for example, who's doing that? Israel did that, right? Israel turned a desert into farmland and planted, right? There's a lot, like, it was there, and then boom, it has all these things. But Israel's not the only one. Now you have Dubai turning desert into turning the desert green. And so they have breathable sand. China found ways to grow stuff in their deserts as well, which is important. And then finally, we have desert. We have Saudi Arabia, I believe. It's bigger than some places in Ukraine. They've created farmland. Okay, so the Middle East has found technologies, including this these circles, because they have the rotating arm that's watering the crops, and they have these circles essentially. Come on, I hate these advertisements. This capitalism. Let's talk about this form of capitalism for a second. The big tech has ads, and ads are a zero-sum game, meaning that whoever is right now running this ad is trying to get people to their company. Okay, and their competitors are running ads to get people to their company. There's only so many consumers, so what they're doing is they're paying money to this big tech company in order to get people to each other's videos, each other's money generating businesses, right? And of course, they don't give you the software. Look at this. This is going to be software that runs on their servers, and they're advertising to you that you could use their software and put your data on their servers and then get locked into their thing. How great for them. Notion. Okay, so that's the ad, right? Notion AI now for everyone. So Notion is a big company, right? Now they're helping you, but of course they own all the data, and the AI will help them to mine all that data. They ain't giving it to you. Stable Diffusion is open source. They're not giving it to you. Same, look at all these other videos. All these other videos, right, are essentially trying to get you to watch them. Hey, look at me. Honest Trailers. There's a bunch of them here. Targeted this particular video for some reason. And pays who? Pays Google, right? Pays YouTube. So that they are a zero-sum game. If I watch their thing, hey, Vsauce here.
Michael here.
And then Michael, guess what? I'm ADD. I'm going to go to something else now. Bye-bye, Michael. And so the idea is it is a zero-sum game, right? So all these ads that you see that are pre-roll ads, they make you watch them, right? That's what happens. That's capitalism. Does it benefit you? Well, does it benefit the companies? Well, they're all paying Google. They're all paying the big tech company so that they can get essentially traffic to their website. So, okay, let's look at, this is Saudi Arabia.
Hello guys, and welcome to our channel.
This is Saudi Arabia.
Is now food secure? Agriculture in Saudi Arabia has been a key focus. Government launched an
amazing, isn't it?
To meet the water needs.
So Israel did it long ago through sheer, force of will, like people trying to return back to the land and plant and everything. And now we have technology that can do all these things. Go from this, right, and Petra to to perhaps creating green. And when forests arrive, then of course the water returns and the rains return, and a lot of the desert becomes arable land. We can even do this here in the USA, where you could look at the map of USA desert, and you could see there's a lot that we could do. A ton. There's a lot of desert. I flew over this desert for hours and hours and hours, in Mojave Desert, and you got all of this. This could eventually turn into something, but not if we have global warming. Then this will remain probably desert, but then things up north will green. So again, the governments are working with industry to create problems for people in terms of health and diabetes and obesity, even for the kids. But they tell you diet and exercise, take care of it yourself. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And the brainwashing gets so bad, they even opposed Bloomberg's ban on giant sugary containers in the name of freedom. I am free to drink myself to diabetes and die earlier because, well, freedom. Fine, but the point is, how about the government reins in the corporations, right? Container size is just one little part of it. Tinkering on the edges, factory farms, like I said. And then, of course, they're overusing antibiotics, which now leads to antibiotic-resistant superbugs. Factory farming is driving another public health crisis. So you thought the coronavirus was bad? Well, now think about all of these MRSA resistant bacteria. Staphylococcus is just one of them. They give it to the piggies. They give it to the, look at them. They're so happy. They're happy and they're big and they're plump and they grow really big, and then you eat them. And then, of course, resistant bacteria also travel through the food supply. and bacteria, critically resistant important medicines present on pork products. And guess what? Now it turns out that resistant bacteria are becoming a big health crisis. Increasing resistance in hospitals. Okay, again, a negative externality. So ideally, the role of government should be to identify these things, at least tax them, if not legislate them, regulate them, tax them, make it not cost effective for these companies to create all the plastic containers and all the factory farms and put sugar into everything, okay? And stop telling people that you can't have a straw, you can't have a bag, you can recycle your way. It's all a scam, okay? And similarly, when the factory farms, they tell them go vegan, and that's nice, you should go vegan, but again, how about solving the problem upstream? And finally, plastic containers, again, the recycling and the exercising and the choice, it could go on. Fossil fuels, right? The public is told, keep commuting to the office, work long hours. I had a lot of videos about this. They just made studies where Japan, 4-hour work week, no loss of productivity, okay? And so the studies were done, and let's see what happened. Productivity jumped. Oh, wow. Productivity jumped 40%. So there are industries in which we could actually have people work less. How would the government do this? Again, by taxing anything beyond that. So, for example, mandating overtime pay past, a certain time. And so people would have to be paid more. And of course, you could look at the vaccines. The government and the industry failed us. First with mask production, which everyone agrees, they could have had masks much earlier, and they didn't, because again, they only care when the barn door is already open and the horse has left the barn. In fact, look, the Trump government, to its credit, took out all the stops, and Operation Warp Speed green-lighted mRNA vaccines, and they were very fast. In fact, they made one for HIV, mRNA vaccines for HIV, okay, back then. Okay, I don't know who would necessarily need it, because HIV is not a pandemic, and if you're married, like what's the point? And but anyways, well, I mean, you're married anyway. But what happened was they can do it. But what's interesting, lo and behold, the warp speed mRNA industry just can't seem to produce vaccines for Delta, Mu, Lambda, and all these other variants. The one you're being jabbed with, the one you're taking, is likely the same original one that targeted the first variant. Not that effective. I could be wrong. Let's check it out. Latest boosters are still the old variant, Alpha. Let's see if that's true. As far as I know, from what I understood, they're all kind of still targeting Alpha. So how about this? Boosters effective against, sure, Omicron, whatever, fine. Let's see. All right, so I have to admit that they did eventually go ahead and put out vaccines that target a new variant. But if we see here, Delta variant vaccines efficacy, what happened was they didn't, in fact, the mRNA warp speed industry was not putting out these vaccines. My point is also that, again, a lot of times if they ask you to jab yourself with an old vaccine, and many people get the old vaccines, it's because the government just mandates it. So the pharma industry doesn't have to innovate. They don't have to target the next thing. And if people voluntarily of their own free will would actually choose, hey, I don't want Windows 95. I want Windows XP. I want the latest Windows Vista, right? But it's like, well, jab yourself with Windows 95. Like, okay, this is, it's a contentious issue, but I think just this one part of it, that you don't necessarily have to do it. if the government comes in and again works with the industry together, you get this thing where the industry doesn't need to innovate, doesn't need to create non-biodegradable plastics, doesn't need to create up-to-date vaccines as much as they had to. And I just want to show you what it's like when there is no profit motive. So U.S. Army vaccine, all variants. So back in 2021, U.S. Army created a single vaccine against all. Stop it with the ads, man. Continue to cite in 12 seconds, 11 seconds. Don't give me 10 seconds to rant about this. This is what your internet's becoming. You're going to have ads by Google. You're going to have OpenAI own the AI that you're going to talk to, and Microsoft Bing. This is, you're going to live in digital feudalism unless there's an open source. So U.S. Army creates single vaccine against all COVID and SARS variants. This was back in 2021. What is this now, 2023? So what did they do with this? Nothing. Not that I know of anyway, but how was the Army able to do this when the private industry wasn't? Well, within weeks, they expect to announce they've developed a vaccine. This was back in 2021. All the variants, even Omicron. Why? Because they took a different approach and because they didn't have a profit motive to sell the old product before they get the new one out the door, right? Why would you cannibalize your old sales when you don't have to and they're selling like hotcakes and the government's helping you, right? So there's unintended consequences. You know that famous story, the government there were too many rats in Australia and they paid for each rat tail that was, and in the beginning it worked. People killed the rats, but eventually they realized they could just breed more rats. And so in the end, there were actually more rats than when the government, and before the government gave that bounty. So there's unintended consequences. People are adapt in ways you didn't expect. So whether it's, and these are just some examples, processed foods, factory farms, plastic containers, fossil fuels, and vaccines. In every single case, the government works together with the industry, whether it's with patent enforcement or whether it's just banning people from exposing factory farms, or whether it's, having the plastic containers be shipped and then putting bans on plastic straws, keeping people distracted, mandating recycling, which just carries water for these people, for these industries. And speaking of water, a lot of the industries in California using the water are in fact big corporations, right? I think Pistachio, California, what is it? Controversy water. I forgot what it was, but it's just crazy. Pistachio growers, meet the California couple who uses more water every day than every home in Los Angeles combined. I mean, everything you've seen today, oh my goodness, the amount of the human biomass, the plastic mass versus fish, the human biomass versus mammals. This couple uses more than every home in LA. It's just, I'm just telling you that there are huge issues and the government is exacerbating them. So I think the point has been made. I think trying to get government to solve our issues is not necessarily the approach. So what is the approach? The approach is open source software. I'll get to it in a second, but now I want to talk about, just briefly show you what the politicians are saying, and then what the venture capitalists are saying, and then I'll get to finally to the solutions. So here's what politicians are saying.
Enough with your greed and with your corruption. We need real change in this country.
So you don't think that's what Elizabeth Warren is saying?
Well, Elizabeth is a friend of mine. She will speak for herself. I've just told you what I feel.
You've said there are differences, and you,
Well, the difference is,
just mentioned a label.
Well, it's not a label. I mean, Elizabeth considers herself, if I got the quote correctly, to be a capitalist to her bones. I don't. And the reason I am not is because I will not tolerate for 1 second the kind of greed and corruption and income and wealth inequality and so much suffering that is going on in this country today, which is unnecessary.
So like Bernie comes at it from a point of view of like, he correctly diagnoses that the government is working with the corporations. As I remind you, I've shown you how regulatory capture happens. I've shown you how the lobbyists wrote the regulation, the Medicare Part D, and all these things that he talks about, and cost of insulin, and how he took people to Canada and so on. Where Bernie might be getting it wrong, however, is he underestimates very much the promise of technology in disrupting the capitalist corporatist model. When I say corporatist, I feel like it's nicer because libertarians and ANCAPs get me. So I'm going to say corporatist. Disrupting the corporatist model with open source software, for example, or with software is given to the people. It's going to be huge. I'll give you an example. Bernie Sanders says that all colleges, public colleges, should be tuition free. Now, notice, by the way, he doesn't say all colleges should be free. He's saying public colleges be tuition free. So that's important. And he's basically saying that like a community college should be able to be affordable and stuff. I agree with him overall that education should be available to everyone. And we as a society should use our tax dollars to fund that. Where I disagree is I don't think we should be going and putting that into colleges when we have massive online courses. So for example, I have this idea of putting together in the future an app for teachers and teaching people. And so using my own technology, we could easily put an app together for anyone to teach their own course. Now you're getting the sense of what I build. I build essentially platforms that power applications that serve the people. So we got the platform like qbix and Intercoin. Then on top of the platform, we've got the applications like the teaching app. And then on top of that, there's people building their little business, their little businesses on top of it. And we give the platform away. It's open source, and we just make money with the utility tokens and other network advantages, essentially, where we're the first mover on our own network, but everyone else can jump in, just like IPFS, host a node, serve some files, run a qbix node, run an Intercoin node, and so on. So we got these two operating systems that I build. If you want to read more about them, just go ahead, right on the forum. Join the community. So this is what the teaching app would look like. Teaching app liberates the teachers from having to essentially work for colleges, work for schools, with all of the stuff that comes in it, the societal implications, right? And they can get their own style, and the kids can actually benefit from a free market of teachers, people who are willing to actually teach, actually get people to learn stuff. We can have more girls taking STEM courses. We can have girls in Afghanistan taking this and so on. And of course, rather than having central servers in California where everyone would be connecting to, everyone could run it locally, download and run it locally, which is sometimes very important in rural areas. This is just one example where instead of taking a top-down government approach like Bernie wants, we could take a bottom-up software approach like I advocate. No child left behind. Remember that? Great slogan, terrible execution. Basically, that's the George W. approach. Yeah, we're going to sign something, and then the kids are going to learn. And it turns out, no. And by the way, what's with all these masks? Now, okay, I'm not even going to get into that. I'll just say this, and this is another topic, that the kids there's a huge uptick in diagnosis of ADHD because the kids are being told to sit down and shut up for 10 hours a day sometimes, because frankly, they're part of a system, a government system that the parents have to put them in. And why? Because the parents have to make money to survive, because now both the men and the women, they join the corporate America and they essentially climb the corporate ladder and they have to make rent. I talk about this in some of my other things. We talk about, here we go. We talk about a lot of things here, but one of the things I want to talk about is women in tech. Women in tech is awesome, but all of these things have been co-opted. Basically, what's been co-opted is like women's liberation, for example, great movement, but now they're telling you to work for the corporations. And so men and women who buy into this idea of working for the corporations, essentially they work 10 hours a day and then they neglect their kids. So of course the kids, you can say no child left behind, but their parents are not really that much involved in their lives 10 hours a day. The administrators are, and the teachers have to listen to the administrators. And so they have this idea of like the DSM-5 has all these diagnoses, right? They have autism spectrum, right? They also have gender dysphoria, they call it now. They used to call it transgenderism, gender dysphoria. And again, look, a lot of people experience these things. They need individual love and attention. There's a real paucity, a dearth of love when your parents have to work 10 hours a day. And so whether it's, you know, TikTok girls now experiencing like TikTok girls depression, okay, it's like record levels of depression now. Worse depression and anxiety, reduced working capacity, and it turns out now record levels of depression, teenage girls. So it turns out TikTok has become a dangerous mental disorder breeding the record levels of sadness in teen girls, CDC reports. This is this year, okay? And you could see similar studies with teens and suicides and colleges and overwork and homework creep and all this stuff. But it comes down to, again, people are away working all these hours. These couples are now both working, both parents. So what are they going to do? So most people can't afford good daycare. They put them in the government schools, whatever, you know, is available. And the administrators of those schools want to cover their ass. So if the child is, you know, experiencing ADHD, they're going to say, well, why don't we just provide amphetamines to them, like Ritalin and Adderall. So like Adderall is an amphetamine, actually. It's not a methamphetamine, but it's only a couple atoms away from it. And there are studies that have shown it has just the same kinds of effects in terms of like addiction and so on. So Adderall is literally an amphetamine, and the crystal meth is not legal, but the Adderall stuff that they give to the kids is to pacify them and to get them to concentrate. And of course, the college kids then also continue using it. You got middle-aged women now on antidepressants, about 1 in 4, which is also crazy. 1 in 4 middle-aged women antidepressants. And of course, there's an opioid epidemic among men. Okay, 1 in 5 are using antidepressants. Okay, and of course, there's the opioid epidemic with the men, which is just the pharma industry's role in that is pretty egregious. So again, what am I talking about here? I'm saying simply that if you try to solve these things with government, you see the problem is upstream, and we do need to keep fighting and trying to get our governments to do something like, but what type of things should they do? Well, they should give the money to everyone, like vouchers, so they can choose their own school, they can choose their own teachers, or they can pay for massive online courses. They should increase overtime pay after 30 hours, so maybe a 30-hour work week. So then people can spend time with their kids at the dinner table, maybe a 3-day weekend. Maybe they can devote themselves to writing open source software, or doing science, or doing hobbies, or raising their kids and showing them love. These are investments we can make in our society, and conservatives should support this, because then your kids grow up better and we have better citizens. In fact, I'm going to show you one thing. Tucker Carlson versus Ben Shapiro on capitalism. Tucker Carlson actually talks about this with Ben Shapiro. And
this is not just a deck of cards. This is a collection.
I'm tired of these ads. Let's see. Here we go. I'll try to do it. There's a 50-minute thing, but there's also something. Ben Shapiro on automation. Let's see. I hope there's one clip. I saw it before. I don't want to go through the whole 50. Ben Shapiro, to his credit, interviewed Andrew Yang. He interviewed Tucker Carlson. Here we go. This. Should we limit technology?
The way to prevent the elites, an elite class, from controlling other people's lives is to restrict the inherent power of government to control everybody's life. When you suggested before that the goal of the society should be stability, everyone wants a stable society, but there are lots of different, you say this in the book, there are lots of different types of stable societies. Yes. Right? There are monarchies that are stable societies. There are communist regimes that are stable. Right, societies. Exactly. They're dictatorships that are incredibly, North Korea is a very stable society. That's right. So is the goal of our society stability?
So here we go.
Seeing the incidence of fatherlessness.
Go read about this. Tucker Carlson makes a good paleoconservative case for like restricting the free market to some extent, and not necessarily allowing family destruction.
Like Spike. Yep. It's unknown in my neighborhood. I live in a rich neighborhood. I'm sure you do too. Right. Like everyone's married. Okay. Mm-hmm. There's no divorce where I live. In rural America, divorce among white people is now the rule. Out of wedlock births in a lot of zip codes are the majority. It's not. Why did that happen?
And he says white people, the divorce rates among the black population is a lot higher. White, black, Hispanic used to be low for everybody. But then what happens is essentially, where is this? Divorce. And a lot of it is because essentially with all of these top-down government schools or whatever, the government plays the role of the the mother and the father, in some cases, they kind of abdicate their roles these days, and all of the stuff has been automated, like the dishwashing and the laundry and everything that was traditionally like women stayed at home and were the homemakers, nothing much to do at home, so they go work for the corporations. What they don't realize is there's a ton to do. There's a ton. You could raise your kids, you could do science, you could do hobbies, but they don't have the time to do it. So divorce rate, you could go read it, but essentially, where is this? Divorce rate by race. You could see that it's also correlated to how well the kids are doing when they grow up, because you got one, okay, where is this? You go look it up. I can't look it up right now. I wasn't prepared to look at it, but I remember seeing that essentially the divorce rate in the Black community has skyrocketed. The out of wedlock rates, having kids out of wedlock, not even having a marriage in place before the kids arrive, has skyrocketed, and as a result, it stagnated. The economic opportunities have stagnated. It's correlated. So we could talk about it in another episode, and we talk about how the government is involved in marriages, is involved in the incentives for divorce, and so on. Of course, there's religion, right? Divorce used to be illegal in a lot of the Christian denominations, and it also was illegal by religious law. And also polygamy was legal, in Islamic, but illegal in Christian societies, which again, so if you have a kid, on the side with someone, with your side chick or mistress, as they used to say, you can't take it. It's a bastard child, as they used to call it. So in a Muslim country, obviously they would take responsibility for both families. They would have to. And also there was, you had to get married really early on. That would lead also to a lot of involuntary celibate people, incels, right? And there's a lot of violence also. People don't have enough women to go around. And so polygamy and violence are correlated. In the West, they've basically, what they've done is they created a period before marriage, right? This out of wedlock with the contraceptives, where essentially you got the same Pareto distribution, where 20% of the guys get 80% of the girls, or even more, even more skewed. And but because there is no marriage, there's no adultery, and so you could do whatever you want essentially until you got married. Sow your wild oats, so to speak. And so people get it out of their system, their natural inclinations. Men with their, because men are more expendable in war, therefore there's less men throughout history, and therefore men sort of have this are more promiscuous. There's also more promiscuous because biologically they can repopulate and have more children at a time. You could see this after every war. You could see in Yemen and Ukraine. You're going to see this. You saw this in USSR, which lost 30 million people, that women wanted to be a second wife or a mistress or something, rather than being celibate for life and having no children. It doesn't make sense for society. It doesn't make sense for the individual woman to not reproduce and to not have any children. So obviously, after these horrific wars, polygamy becomes important. Like in Utah, they had the Mormons were persecuted by the US government, and then they had polygamy to repopulate themselves. So polygamy happens in that sense, but it also leads to the other way, where it's like no war, there's not enough women to go around. And so I always say, if you want to avoid wars, just genetically engineer more women, babies than men. It just happens that humans are pretty warlike, at least in their brains still. And they're thinking, where's the war? And the men are thinking, where's my multiple women? Not everyone, things are changing, but for the most part, that part of our psyche still leads to a lot of the wars. So anyway, my point simply is that if you're going to look at society, you could look at how to organize society, and you might want to create bottom-up ways to do it. But let's look at how. Let's just really quickly look at male, female wages, truck driving. Check this out. Check this out.
Monzo.com makes games.
Oh.
You know what? I'm not going to say it again because I never were. And
okay, that's
in a second.
Here we go.
So would you, Tucker Carlson, be in favor of restrictions on the ability of trucking companies to use this sort of technology specifically to, sort of artificially maintain the number of jobs that are available in the trucking industry.
Are you joking? In a second. In a second. In other words, if I were president, when I say to DOT, to Department of Transportation, we're not letting driverless trucks on the road, period. Why? Really simple. Driving for a living is the single most common job for high school educated men in this country, in all 50 states. By the way, that's the same group whose wages have gone down by 11% over the past 30 years. The social cost of eliminating their jobs in a 10-year span, 5-year span, 30-year span is so high that it's not sustainable. So the greater good is protecting your citizens from, look, capitalism is the best economic system I can think of. I think that anyone's ever thought of, but that doesn't mean that it's a religion and everything about it is good.
No, but
there's no Nicene Creed of capitalism that I have to buy into.
This is very, very important. People are starting to wake up and criticize the religion of the United States, which is capitalism. I coined this little thing. I like to say you can't criticize the profit and the profit. FIT, because seriously, like in this country, if you do have a criticism of capitalism, it's customary to preface by saying there's nothing wrong with capitalism, but it's always blamed on something else, government, this and that. Capitalism inherently, in and of itself, like I've shown you, leads to factory farms. Like, what market mechanism is going to get you out of that market failure or that, billions of animals being harmed? Some people rationalize it, like they rationalized slavery and said, well, that's the natural order of things. Animals have no moral rights. We can do whatever we want. But I mean, even in these religions like Judaism and Christianity, animal rights were considered significant. You shouldn't just harm animals just for if it's avoidable. And so people need to go back to how, the wisdom of, like in the Bible, they had the land lie fallow every 7 years. The Dust Bowl wouldn't have happened if people were to allow the land to not work it to the bone. But with capitalism, the farmers get into the race to the bottom. You can see all of these once you start seeing it, right? You see what happens is that automation causes more productivity, right? So farmers in a race to the bottom, Great Depression. So if you read it, what happened, a lot of it, and you can also see a lefty economist like Joseph Stiglitz talk about the Great Depression. What's interesting, as he highlights, is that before the Great Depression, 20% of all Americans worked in a farm-related job. After the Great Depression, today, only 2% work. So it was disrupted. How was it disrupted? Well, if you look at essentially, pictures of farms, a farm early 20th century, oxen, horses, people laboring, right? You're going to see stuff like this, right? You're going to see a lot of this. And so there's a lot of farm hands. And today, even we have cotton pickers. We have, but we have fruit pickers and people coming over from Mexico and so on. So back then they had slavery with the cotton pickers and they needed that, right? My point is that it got all automated, which is about to happen now with the wage slaves of Amazon being automated and becoming robots, replaced by robots. Here's the thing. Once things got automated, in this case by things called combines on a farm, farms started looking more like this, right? You have a machine called a combine, and then it does the work of like many farmers. So you essentially had farmers every year have a record amount of food being produced. And then they said, well, now the prices are dropping. So in a perverse economic sense, the farmer said, well, I have a good work ethic. I'm going to work harder next year and I'm going to produce a crop that, I'll make up for it on volume, right? And so every farmer did that. And the next year, the crops were even more, they just lay in the fields and like there's too much produced. So the government paid the farmers, government paid farmers not to plant. And that's how they were able to get rid of the Great Depression. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was essentially a New Era deal designed to boost agricultural prices by reducing surpluses. But what happened in the meantime is that once you had all these farms do this, they took the arable land and they extracted all the nutrients because their survival as a farm family was tied to how much they could sell. So then in a race to the bottom in a downward spiral, the prices kept going down like your Luna tokens. And basically someone had to step in from the market and fix this. So when people say capitalism is not necessarily good, they are in fact treated as if in Saudi Arabia you said that the Muhammad is not a non-actual prophet. So as I said, you cannot criticize the prophet. In Saudi Arabia, if you say the word Muhammad, it's customary to append the words peace be upon him. And when you say capitalism in the United States, it's customary to prepend the words there's nothing wrong with capitalism, but. So any criticism has to be prepended or appended by these things. And so, look, we're starting to wake up and we're starting to say that maybe other economic systems like safety nets plus gift economy, open source, may actually be better. So this is what Tucker Carlson eventually says.
Care about is living in a country where, you know, decent people can live happy lives, actually. And so, no, I would say immediately, no, are you joking? And I maybe would make up some pretext for public consumption, like, oh, they're dangerous. The technology is not quite finessed. No. But the truth would be, I don't want to put.
My name is Jim Rickards. I'm a former.
I think the ads speak for themselves, okay? Content is sacrificed on the altar of profit here, and they have to because these ads are in a race to the bottom, okay? This is a zero-sum game with these ads, and the market's shrinking, okay? Or at least it's skewing towards people with AI and people who are making these ads much more personalized and whatever. Similarly, when you buy into FTX and you buy into all these things, all you're doing is you're trying to take money from other people. You're not growing the market. You're not trying to help communities like we're trying to do with Intercoin. You're just trying to, these things help you take money from each other, all right? So if you do this, you get into a system where essentially some people exploit other people. So let's talk about banks. Let's finally talk about banks a little bit, and let's talk about big tech. So banks, we've all known about 2008. I talked about why isn't Wall Street in jail, Matt Taibbi. We talked about a little bit about the Twitter papers, Matt Taibbi and others, exposing what the feds are doing more to protect those people. So when it comes to the banks are critical infrastructure. The feds want to protect the banks. So what do? What are the banks doing, in fact? So banks were the backbone of the American economy. The banks, essentially, the bank underwriters helped to underwrite certain loans and allow certain businesses. Of course, they picked winners and losers, right? If a business gets a loan, they win. If they stave off at least the destruction of their business, right? They get to grow. If a consumer gets consumer credit, they can spend on that credit card for a while. If they don't get the loan, well, they can go bankrupt, or consumer can declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy and just lose all their assets or whatever. So those are government protections, the bankruptcy protections, just to be clear. And the courts are government run. They all kind of put that in place. That's good for entrepreneurship. That is good to take risks, to have a safety net of some kind, as opposed to going to a debtor's prison because you have a negative balance or you have some debts that you have to repay, or going into indentured servitude, work over several years to try to repay. It turns out, funny enough, the community is actually better off with less people being evicted, millions of people being evicted or put into debtors' prisons and so on. So there's ways to create these safety nets, and actually safety nets increase the economic efficiency and prosperity of everyone and health outcomes and whatever. But I digress. Let's go to these banks. So these banks essentially tell you the American dream. The American dream is what? Work. It's basically work for your house and have eventually you end up with a house, picket fence, and your family. That's what it used to be. It used to be wholesome. But also the American dream has morphed into climb the corporate ladder, men and women go and make partner your law firm, and you too could be a billionaire, or you too could be a TikTok influencer. And guess what? Those people are slaves, okay? TikTok influencers can't take a day off because they're sick. Nope, can't take a day off because the algorithm will always, basically own you. You are a slave to it. Literally, so yes, and again, only a few can make it. They always point to these few people, the billionaires, the few, the proud, the Marines. No, I'm kidding. No, the Marines is yet another government thing that it's great, but also they ship you off, and sometimes you don't have any say in whether you have to kill people or not. I respect the people who sign up. I disrespect sometimes the planners that send them, who would never send their own family members to that same war. But anyway, the few, the proud, the Ubermenches, and as Ayn Rand liked to call them, the John Galts of the world, right? The people who may not necessarily use the government, but they amass a big centrally controlled fortune. So what's interesting is that the American dream holds up these people. You could be like Elon Musk. You too could be like Bill Gates and whatever. Just work hard and you too can make it. The reality is, for every one of those people, there's 1,000 other people, 10,000 that tried the same exact thing and didn't get anywhere. So there's an element of luck. There's an element of being connected to large pools of capital. Like, for example, Ashton Kutcher, 1 million followers, Twitter. Not many people remember this, but the first people who got 1 million followers was Ashton freaking Kutcher. And Ashton Kutcher was not a random person. He had a lot of social capital from his movies, and before that 70s show on TV. So the kingmakers of the TV industry found Ashton Kutcher, discovered him, created his career, and then put you out there. So to say that you could become the next Justin Bieber, the next Ashton Kutcher, and look at you, you could have all this. You need a daddy, kingmaker who will create, or mommy or whatever, to kingmake you, okay, most of the time. How did J.K. Rowling become a billionaire with Harry Potter? How did Oprah become? They were both very poor, but they had to have access to the kingmaker. In J.K. Rowling's case, that was the publisher. In Oprah Winfrey's show, it's whoever put on the show, and the network execs. So you have to get in capitalism into these things. Not so with the open web, and not so with the Web3 gatekeepers. I'm about to talk about that, but let's just talk about what happened. So they sold you this idea that you own your house. You don't rent your house. Ownership, it's great. But the thing is, you rent money from the bank. You rent it, and the cost of the renting the money is your interest rate. And it turns out that you pay out sometimes 300% of what you borrowed. So where does that money come from? Well, it got printed over the years, right? Over that 30 years by the government. But you had to earn it. You have to actually go to work, and you have to negotiate higher wages, and you have to serve people, and that's all good. But you're a slave, Neo. You're a slave because essentially you think you own your stuff, but if you don't pay for it, your bank is going to take your house. And that's what happened in 2006 because the speculators just outbid everybody. And they said, you're going to flip the banks, flip the houses in another zero-sum bubble. So these banks are essentially harmed by the government because the central planners at the central bank told them the following. The Federal Reserve requirements is 0. So they said, there we go. On March 15th, the board of, this is from their own website, the Federal Reserve Board reduced reserve requirement ratios to 0%, effective March 26th. It eliminated all reserve requirements for all depository institutions. Great. So Robinhood and your local bank, whatever, don't have to have any reserves, or at least not required for this particular requirement. Now, normally the Fed mandated reserve requirements, right? But since 2020, why? In response to the pandemic, they told the banks who issue most of our money supply, go ahead, issue as much as you want, underwrite whatever loans you want, only subject to your own underwriters. So the balance sheets already became lopsided with all these loans that they gave out to people. And the Austrian economists would say that's malinvestment sometimes. But okay, so the banks gave out these loans and people got, this is different than the $2,400 checks, the UBI that they got, because that, by contrast, is not bank underwriters deciding where the money goes. That is the people getting the check deciding where the money goes. And so the people decided where to put it. Some people decided to put it into crypto. Other people decided to spend it on Main Street, on necessities. So you could see how they were spent, Treasury, not the Fed, sent that money. Was it $1,600 checks? Stimulus checks, I forgot. The one time when everybody got to spend money. So just to be clear, when these loans sometimes fail, the consumer credit fails in the banks, what happens there is that they simply write off they owe each other money, right? Bank A has a depositor who pays someone in Bank B using, say, Venmo. And so Bank B has someone who pays Bank A. So at the end of the day, they settle their things, their debts in something called the Federal Reserve System. So the Federal Reserve System with ACH, automated clearinghouse, okay? This is what happens. Not many people know this, but the Federal Reserve runs the ACH system. Automated clearinghouse system, the ACH payments that you get. It's a nationwide network through which depository institutions send each other batches of electronic credits and debit transfers. So every day they can sort of, so if a bunch of banks loans fail and it sort of gets distributed, right? Then what happens is, yes, some banks are losers that give out all these crazy loans with no income, no asset, no job type of loans. But other banks, more or less, the money supply can expand and shrink, because the money is just a cycle that originates at the banks and then is extinguished at the banks when the loans get repaid. So that's how money, consumer money works and business money works when business is given a loan. Today, that's how it works. But the banking system does have certain banks that don't get the message or don't necessarily do very well. And one of those banks was Silicon Valley Bank. So Silicon Valley Bank had no risk management for a year. They had no chief risk officer, at least. Maybe they had a department, but for some reason, no chief. So through much of 2022, what did they do? Well, they bought up a bunch of treasuries. Okay, so Fed mandates banks buy treasuries. So although they said they have no reserve requirements, they do, in fact, I don't want to say mandate, but they make it really attractive to buy these things. The banks have to buy something for their reserve. They could just hold dollars, but then that's strictly worse than buying a treasury, so you can get some yields. So what happened was that treasury yield right now versus a year ago. Right now it's around 5%. This is so I can't find it right now here, but last year, same time last year. So it's 5% right now. Okay, it's close to 5% on some days. And this same time last year, it was 0.38%. So that means it jumped 5% in 1 year. Sorry, I can't find it here. You could go look it up. There's something like that. So going from almost zero, under 0.5%, to 5%. So the banks that bought it last year were screwed. And one of those banks was Silicon Valley Bank. Yes, they're making interest rates, but also when they have to sell these things in the market, they don't fetch very much, because why would you buy them when you could get yields of 5% now? Why get treasuries at 2%? So when they have to come in and mark to market, as they say, banks mark to market, these things essentially have to sell some of them to some of these treasuries because they have to pay the depositors. And so when the depositors decide to take their money out, that creates a run on the bank, and the bank has to sell these underwater treasuries. And why are they underwater? Because the central bank decided to fight inflation, not with taxation, not with taxing non-biodegradable plastic and fossil fuels and all these things that could improve society by reducing a lot of these things, factory farming, and so on. No, they didn't increase taxes on those things. No, what they did is they simply raised interest rates. And for the first time, they got these unintended consequences of these banks saying, well, now we have all these treasuries that are kind of worthless. So what happens is this particular bank, though, had a second problem, and that is that so many of these venture capitalists banked there. So you got venture capitalists bank at SVB, Silicon Valley Bank. So over half of all venture capitalists bank there, okay? And they urged their clients, please, we stood by you over so many years since 2000, since 1983. We've helped finance the whole industry. And your startups are not easy to finance. I mean, they don't take many loans. They're all financed by your LPs. And like, we work in a special way. Can you now stand by us? He literally said as much in his thing. He said, you know, basically, I don't see it here, but he said, you know, we stood by you. Can you stand by us? But the thing is, right, is that the VCs are, on the one hand, they are very, very, their whole thing is just make money, right? Because VCs are essentially entrepreneurs. Their whole job is basically get into big deals with these companies, network your way into the bigger VC deals, get an exit, get a unicorn, get success, get money, and then you become a big VC. The epitome of that is Peter Thiel. Okay, he's a conservative guy. You could see back in the day when he first began in 1987. Thiel poured. Let's just take a look at Peter Thiel. I think it's a very sort of extreme outlier in the VC industry, but also someone who has shaped how VCs think and how the industry operates. And also you could see the corrosive influence of capitalist, extreme unregulated capitalist thinking on on what could otherwise have been a beautiful sort of development of open source software. And I'll explain. Let's go in the beginning. So what is Peter Thiel's history? So Peter Thiel calls himself a libertarian, is a conservative, a right-wing person who believes in the power of capitalism and business to drive the economy. In 1987, Thiel poured his sense of grievance into the launch of a right-wing newspaper, the Stanford Review. He was in Stanford. It was his first entrepreneurial venture and the beginning of a network that would eventually expand and dominate Silicon Valley. Thiel's primary innovation with the review was to connect the parochial concerns of a small elite, which is conservative Stanford undergraduates, to mainstream national politics. So essentially, he made a journal where free speech, right? He talks about what he believes. I'm not opposed to what he believes. He has a lot of nuance to what he believes, and he's clearly was successful. He's part of the PayPal mafia, which means people that made a lot of money on PayPal. He went on to make many different companies, about which I'll talk about in a second. But his practices and his beliefs may actually be corrosive to the industry at large. This is what he believes. First of all, Peter Thiel, just so you know, was the first one to sound the alarm, also the first to kickstart this, this sort of take advantage of it and take out the money. His fund, you know, his fiduciary responsibility to the fund, he decided that he was going to take his money out. And of course, in a system like banks, to keep a fractional reserve, unlike the stable coin issuers, like for example, USDC, okay, USDC, which is by Circle, they keep 100% of reserves in these various banks, decentralized. So even if some of their money is tied up or even lost to 7%, they're still much more closer to solvent than any of these banks are. So in fact, the stablecoin issuers are held to a higher standard than these banks, much higher standard. And so these banks essentially, this guy, Peter Thiel, kickstarted the whole run on this bank. Everyone acting in their own independent self-interest will soon discover there isn't enough money in the bank. So FDR was right when he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, okay? But these banks, essentially what happened was daddy government and central planners at the Fed decided to have 0% interest rates, told the banks to issue all of these loans on the one side, then they issued these treasuries, and then these treasuries, they kept raising the interest rates on these treasuries rather than increasing the taxes, which was politically unfavorable. The government had to do that. The Fed can't do that. So government didn't raise taxes on these industries polluting the environment. So the Fed had to step in, and what their tools are to raise interest rates. They raise interest rates. They sell treasuries with higher interest rates, which, by the way, puts the government into more debt in the future. These treasuries aren't free. You have to print US dollars eventually to service that debt. So anyways, so these treasuries are being put out, and the curve is so high, the yield curve, the yield is now so high that the banks that bought them last year, like Silicon Valley Bank, now underwater. Silicon Valley Bank was negligent in their risk analysis, decided to buy the treasuries last year. I don't know if like having a chief officer of the risk management would have actually helped in that case. Maybe they would not market these things so much, and so they wouldn't take the loss until interest rates had come down. But that's what it was. And so Peter Thiele, just like with the short selling of these guys of the Wall Street bets, remember the whole short squeeze of the hedge funds, right? It's kind of like that. It's like it kickstarts these things. I talk about that on my blog, memes, markets, and collusion, how things take off and sort of have a life of their own. So the new collusion happens when there's something in common between the people. There doesn't have to be explicit collusion, it's just they have to be part of the same club. In this case, the same club is the VCs. They all bank at the same bank. They all attend the same functions, and they all talk to each other. So of course you get this cartel-like behavior, this herd behavior. They're the most herd-like, actually, the VCs. So, and who are they? They're the venture capitalists, right? They are the ones funding the startups. But maybe there's another engine to fund the startups, which is what I often talk about, which is now utility tokens and decentralized fundraising. So anyways, so we had in 2020, the famous memes promulgated by Wall Street Bets. Essentially, this guy was talking about a short squeeze. He was a big GameStop believer. He was in the, believing that eventually, he just bought GameStop. He didn't even think of what the short squeeze would happen, but eventually he realized that there could be. And so Wall Street Bets piled on. A lot of people piled on. And when people saw the stock going up, they piled on. It was a big bubble, like huge bubble, from $1 all the way up to like $497 at its peak. Okay. So this guy, Keith Gill, his name was Deep Fucking Value at Reddit. So anyways, whether it's HODL Bitcoin or, hexagons or whatever, you're just being told to HODL. That's another thing. That's the other way, right? That's like, don't do a bank run. Don't exit the money. Keep your money there. So like on the one hand, you have the people saying HODL and whatever. And on the other hand, you have like short squeeze and like put a squeeze on these people and take your money. So anyways, but these were all demand side. Okay. Then you got essentially these supply side things where, the depositors at the bank want to take their money out. What happens is if you have something behind it, like an algorithm, you could even have a flash crash. You could have trillions of dollars wiped out in a flash crash like this, okay? Not just banks. It happens because everyone runs the same software. When I was at NYU, one of my classmates told me, why the Black-Scholes equations are so good at predicting the prices of derivatives is because everyone uses these equations, and so they become a self-fulfilling prophecy if everyone uses the same model. And again, when you use the same model, it can lead to essentially coordination, collusion, even though you don't have to. So it's a very interesting article in Curbed magazine. I talk about, it's not that New Yorkers came flooding back to New York as we all thought. The rents went up, and I thought this too. I have to eat my words a little bit. The rents went up so much because everyone was running the same software, okay? The AI is telling people to essentially become a cartel and collude. And in fact, it's not even Real Page, okay? ProPublica did an analysis of Real Page, and they basically found that they're all colluding, but they're actually colluding because of one algorithm. One company provides the algorithm for them to how much to charge. And I think it's driving it, quite honestly, said this Real Page executive. As a property manager, very few of us will be willing to actually raise rents double digits within a single month by doing it manually. Seriously, this is like collusion 2.0. So let's go back to Peter Thiele. Peter Thiele was a conservative guy who started out by creating his Stanford Review for his classmates, the conservative classmates of Stanford. He believed in conservative values and capitalism, good old-fashioned capitalism of making a company. But wait, no, he says competition is for losers and you should build a monopoly. Now, many anarcho-capitalists believe in competition. They believe that any business should be able to come up and disrupt existing things. And so do lefties like Schumpeter, for example, creative destruction. So do a lot of economists. The idea that essentially, people come up and disrupt previous industries. It turns out that Schumpeter is a guy who talks about capitalism, socialism, and democracy. You could read all about books by these kind of guys. I've read Milton Friedman. I've read a lot of economists, Hayek, but I've also read people who talk about democracy. For example, The Veil of Ignorance is by John Rawls, is a very good book. Talks about democracy. You also, there's a lot of interesting economic literature on all sides. But my point is that the industry can actually start to collude and to create these runs on the bank or flash crashes or things like that, because they're all part of the same thing. So Peter Thiele, like I said, the conservative sort of thinker, is sort of an outlier in the VC world, because on one hand, he's a capitalist, but he's very outspoken about the beliefs. He says the quiet part out loud. So he says competition is for losers. If you want to create and capture lasting value, look to build a monopoly. Why monopolies are a good thing. So I'm going to give you, just for a second, again, ads. I'm going to give you just his talk at Google. There's a lot more nuance. He says Google's a monopoly and it benefits people. Apple, Microsoft, they're all monopolies. They benefit people. They pretend they're not monopolies, but they are. Whereas startups, they pretend they're bigger than they are. And in fact, startups, if they don't want to be losers and eke out little margins, they should find ways to capture the market and extract rents. That's basically what he's saying.
Unique, that is somehow less competitive than it looks, because you will want to differentiate, you want to try to attract capital or something like that.
You can see he's a little nervous, and maybe that's the way he speaks, but it's really not. It's because what he's saying is so controversial. Even in the Valley, he's kind of saying the thing out loud. Now look at his shirt. It says Palantir. That's the other thing about Peter Thiele is really weird. He claims to be a libertarian, but at the same time, he starts a company called Palantir, which essentially works with governments to do predictive policing, which is a pre-crime essentially. He helps governments against other governments. He works with the United States intelligence community. It's just a very strange way for a libertarian to behave. And then Peter Thiele, people have said that these people who claim to be libertarians then ask the government to bail them out sometimes. When you build a monopoly, you tend to start hobnobbing with the government. And then you start, after PayPal, he went on to build things like Palantir. But it goes much further than that. You see, Peter Thiele was also an early investor in companies like Facebook. Okay, so for example, Peter Thiele, with his idea, he wrote a book called 0 to 1, How to Build Startups, How to Build the Future. And as you can see, he doesn't say right here, competition is for losers, right on the front page. He kind of buries that in the book. Well, not buries that, but my point is, it's not something you want to advertise up front, because then people are not be a little bit shocked. 0 to 1, that kind of says it all, though. You're a 0 or a 1. You're a loser or you have a monopoly. That kind of thinking had an effect on everybody. So Peter Thiele famously was sort of the Clarion Capital invested in Facebook. He turned a $500,000 investment into a $5 billion investment. In 2002, he founded Clarion Capital after he left PayPal, or I should say, he still worked at, anyway, the point is he had a bunch of money that he decided to put in. And so Mark Zuckerberg, who was that guy? Mark Zuckerberg was actually an open source guy. So Mark Zuckerberg turned down Microsoft $1 million when he was still in high school. Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook, turned on offer, okay, $15 billion. Sure, he did that too. But let's go back. He was a veteran at turning down money. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, come on. He turned down Yahoo for $1 billion. He turned down Microsoft for $15 billion. But what I want to talk about is in high school. So back in high school, Mark Zuckerberg created this Winamp player, the Winamp plugin sort of thing. Oh, come on. No, not the 1 billion. Turned down $1 million. Come on. Open source. I don't want to have to put the social network movie on, but okay. Before he ever got to college, turned down by a Winamp. Fine. Really? It's so hard to find these days. Here we go. Synapse. So Synapse was basically, if you like this music, you're going to love that music. Even before he founded Facebook, the young Zuckerberg was on Microsoft's radar. The company had tried to buy Synapse, a computer program he had written where he could learn and predict the user's listening habits. He chose to enroll in Harvard. The opposite of what Peter Thiele says. Peter Thiele famously tells people not to enroll in college. I happen to agree with Peter Thiele on that. He would give them $100,000 to enroll in his program, which essentially helps them become startup founders. Anyway, Synapse was built to help detect the user's preferences in music and drew the attention of Microsoft, and AOL tried to get him to sell it for $1 million, which would have meant he had to drop out of high school to develop it. But my point is he did it open source. Zuckerberg, Synapse, open source. He open sourced it. He put it up on the internet. Mark Zuckerberg's Harvard career according to The Crimson. So let's look at Mark Zuckerberg. So in The Crimson, populism. Okay, open story continues. Okay. Though these days Zuckerberg has other projects on his to-do list, the sophomore back then anticipates Synapse's future success. This is before Facebook, before FaceMash. He says he and D'Angelo are considering making Synapse open source. Zuckerberg's software populism goes beyond simply turning down big money corporate offers. It is important to us that people are able to use the software for free, he preaches. Software belongs to everyone. No matter what kind of deal we get into, we're going to try to keep it free, which, to his credit, he has done with Facebook. However, it's not just about keeping it free in the sense that people don't pay for it, because then he has advertisers pay for it. It's about giving people the software so that they can run it on their own servers. So with open source, this is what he was doing here. People they need to make this distinction clear. Back then, Zuckerberg was a real open source guy, okay? It's important that people are able to use the software for free. The question is, can they use it on their own computers or on his server farm? But he wanted to make it open source. Now look at this with Mark Zuckerberg. Wirehog, Zuckerberg's side project that almost killed Facebook. We put a bullet in that thing. That's how Sean Parker fondly looks back at Wirehog. According to him and author David Kirkpatrick, it was a side project that Mark Zuckerberg found equally as interesting as Facebook. What was Wirehog? Wirehog is a peer-to-peer file sharing service, peer-to-peer, decentralized, that hooked up to Facebook. When it launched in 2004, it was Zuckerberg thinking ahead of his time, Parker says. It was an app that worked on top of Facebook. This was well before the platform, the centralized platform. It existed until early 2006 when, according to Kirkpatrick, it died because Sean killed it. So what happened? So an open source peer-to-peer software that would actually be sharing files. It's like IPFS ahead of its time. It's like Web3 ahead of its time. So what happened? How did Mark Zuckerberg go from a guy who was open sourcing his software and giving it away, and even when he was doing Facebook and he was funded by Peter Thiele, he still wanted to do this? Well, because people like Sean Parker and Peter Thiele changed his mind, and he became a corporate golden boy, where he basically, Facebook acquires Instagram, Facebook acquires WhatsApp, Facebook acquires Oculus, right? 1 billion for Instagram, 18 or 19 billion for WhatsApp, I'm sorry, 16 billion. And the Oculus. All these founders ended up leaving after the golden handcuffs were done, disgusted with the company's push. Like, for example, John Carmack left. John Carmack is a legend, right? He built Wolfenstein and id Software and everything. And he worked on this stuff. He even worked on something called Armadillo Aerospace and little rockets that he put into space. Really cool. So this guy left disgusted with sort of the culture. And he wrote this letter, John Carmack disgusted with Meta, okay? And again, why? Well, because Mark Zuckerberg became this guy who just buys up his competition and then tells them this is what's going to happen, right? We're going to build this metaverse and everyone's going to live in our world and this is what's going to happen. And within the company, he's like a dictator who says this is going to happen, that's going to happen. And people who say yes, Zuck, yes men, get promoted. Those who don't, whatever. That is what Carmack said. I have a voice on some of the highest levels here, so it feels like I should be able to move things, but I'm obviously not persuasive enough. We constantly self-sabotage and squander effort. Well, listen, that happens everywhere. I mean, Google has these amazing products within the company, including ChatGPT, which it had like 4 years ago, and then just kind of like makes it, you know, Google had ChatGPT years ago, right? And the executives didn't let the technologists do it. The executives blocked it, citing concerns that didn't meet company standards, which, by the way, this I respect because they, you know, the safety issues. But what I'm trying to say is that the way these corporations are run are top-down. If you want to have a good talk on this, this is top-down corporation running. Richard Wolff at Google Talks. He talks exactly about this, democracy at work, curing capitalism. He talks about how, imagine if companies were run democratically and everyone decided what to produce, how to go to market. And everyone decided what the wages would be and so on. Not just the top, not just the people who sit on each other's board and stuff like that. It's just we trade for one type of elite, which was in the USSR, the political elite, for another type, which is the corporate elite. But regardless, how did Mark Zuckerberg go from a guy who wanted to give away and gave away Synapse as open source and to a guy and wanted to, you know, from a guy who wanted to create Wirehog and created it to a guy who killed all of that and became a corporate golden boy? Well, because people like Peter Thiel and Sean Parker. So Sean Parker, I saw him at TechCrunch Disrupt, and Sean Parker literally told us on stage about this Wirehog thing, 2010. That's how I remember this. Was it 2010? I think it was 2010. Yeah, 2010. So he was on TechCrunch Disrupt, and I heard this myself. Literally, oh yeah, this is Mark Arrington. I was there. I was like in the audience listening to this. So people don't know these stories. They don't remember this. So what happened is, who is Sean Parker? Well, Sean Parker was a guy who wanted to give things away with file sharing as well. Sean Parker started Napster, right? He's played by Justin Timberlake in the movie. So Sean Parker started Napster, okay? And he also liked to program, hacking, programming. What happened to this guy? What happened is, when he started Napster, Napster was opposed by record labels, the record, another sort of centralized industry which relies on government to essentially go after people and prop up their business model, right? They might make a lot of business now, even with file sharing, but they relied on the easy mode of having the government men with guns, you know, come out and say, you can't copy this movie, and your VHS tapes are, you know, you can't use a VCR in this way or that way, or your TiVo, and you can't do this and that. And, you know, so when Napster came out, it was centralized and they had a target, and the target was Napster. So they destroyed it. Lawsuits by various industry associations eventually shut down the service of government courts. At the time, Napster has been called the fastest growing business of all time. Well, given letting people share freely seems to be a popular thing. Also, the web did that. It's credited with revolutionizing the music industry and considered some precursor to iTunes, because Steve Jobs was able to do it in a corporate friendly way. So basically, Sean Parker turned over a new leaf. He became a corporate golden boy. He launched Plaxo, a way to put all your address and social networks into their servers. He learned how to play the game. And so Parker saw a site called The Facebook, right? And his roommate's girlfriend. And at that point, he was decided to bring him to Peter Thiel. And so essentially, he showed Mark Zuckerberg how to retain control of his company, how to become a corporate golden boy. And even when Mark Zuckerberg got out of line and said essentially that I'm going to build all this open source stuff, they put a bullet in that thing, and they feel really good about killing the open source permissionless file sharing for the people platform that Mark Zuckerberg was going to build. So that is really a problem. And that illustrates very well the difference between the mentality of someone who, like Peter Thiel, the 3 steps to building a monopoly, according to Peter Thiel, and the efforts of someone like Linus Torvalds, who builds Linux, or let's say Mark Zuckerberg, early Mark Zuckerberg, but I'm saying like someone who is like Vitalik Buterin, who makes Ethereum and just gives it away, right? If something happens to Linus Torvalds tomorrow, if something happens to Vitalik Buterin tomorrow, or if something happens to Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the web, their platforms are not going to miss a beat, okay? God forbid anything would happen to these guys, but the point is that their platforms are not dependent on them anymore. Now compare that to everything that these venture capitalists promote. Start small and monopolize, scaling up. Once you create and dominate a niche market, then you should gradually expand into related other markets. Amazon shows how it could be done. Jeff Bezos' founding vision was not just was to dominate all of online retail, but he very deliberately started with books. So it's not a bad situation for the consumers, but it's not a great situation for producers. Uber takes like half of the drivers' salaries and gives it to its shareholders and the 1 engineer per million people. Now, what happens with Amazon? It squeezes the publishers. It also tells them we're going to sell for whatever price we want. It squeezes the warehouse slaves, essentially, for many years. Now it replaced them with Kiva robots, but for a very long time it said, look, take it or leave it. No bathroom breaks for you. So that kind of thing is great for the consumer, not so great when you're a producer. So we have to either give a UBI to people and stop expecting them to be producers to just survive, give them a safety net. It's a reasonable thing to do. And with AI, they may have to do that. And the other way is to actually have a different system that we can actually work with, besides simply tying your healthcare to your employment, tying your health insurance and your salary to your employment. If you want to have that, you need to actually have open source software. We could do both. People could have a system where they are, in fact, free and open source, free in the sense of having UBI and health insurance and everything, just by virtue of being a citizen. And at the same time, they will start to work on open source and Wikipedia and open scientific endeavors and so on. So this is what happens. So Peter Thiel essentially is an epitome of a guy who works with government, who thinks that you should build monopolies, and who, together with Sean Parker, turn Mark Zuckerberg from a guy who loves to give things away and give people peer-to-peer sharing to a guy who buys up his competition and so on. Now, the web, this is the key now. I'm going to talk about the solution. I'm talking about the problems. Here is the non-government solution to big tech monopolies and the big banks. The Twitter papers illustrate the problem. Government and corporations working together. They used to call it fascism, by the way. Government and corporations working together. I don't know why fascism means a little bit something else, but somehow one of the tenets of fascism was corporatism. So it's not necessarily fascism, but corporatism featured heavily in fascism. Basically, Benito Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy advocated the collective management of the economy by state officials by integrating the large interest groups under the state, which is a combination of crony capitalism and state capitalism. But if you look at corporatism in the mainstream, in the social liberal democracies, liberal democratic societies, it still has that centralized character, corporatism, whether it's private interests lobbying the government or the other way around, or working with the government, as I've shown. So what is the bottom-up thing? The bottom-up thing looks like this. intercoin.org / let's say deck PDF. All right. So let's go through the memory lane, down memory lane. So in the 90s, we had gatekeepers too. In the 90s, we had these gatekeepers like America Online for the internet, Minitel in France. You had CompuServe. You had, Microsoft Network, MSN. You had Prodigy. Anyone remembers these companies? They're all done because the web basically got everyone to exit. Just like Napster was like the fastest growing thing. Funny enough, turns out if you give people the tools to run their own thing, they're going to do it. And so who exited wasn't the end user, it wasn't the grandma, it wasn't the average person, it was the people who had New York Times, AOL keyword New York Times, right? So rather than living in a walled garden that belongs to someone else, they said, why don't we create NewYorkTimes.com, right? And in short order, they funded something like WordPress. They were one of the first investors in WordPress, and in fact, it runs their stuff today. Now, this is open source. This runs their own site. This does not. And I sign in with Google. Guess what? Google controls this. This is run by Google.com, right? And if I go ahead, Google will share my name, email address, profile picture with the New York Times, right? And so New York Times trusts Google for all of this stuff. There you go, confirm. Boom. And I've just created an account. While that is simple, and New York Times now wants me to pay, okay, it will ask me to pay eventually. But the point is, Google controls the relationship New York Times has to its readers. Not very cool, right? Sale, blah, blah, blah. Now, that's a problem, isn't it? Because what happens if Google starts to exert pressure on New York Times in that relationship? What if New York Times wants to have its own relationship? Well, that's what the web allowed them to do. Web 2.0. I'll get there in a second. So Web 1.0 allowed companies like newspapers and magazines and so on to be decentralized. So the gatekeepers were also newspapers, magazines. Before the 90s, it was newspapers, magazines, radio, TV, right? To get your song on the radio, you had to get a gatekeeper to agree. To get something published in a magazine, you had to get someone to agree. And so that was tied to the physical distribution network of the magazine or the newspaper, right? And going into all the stores and being printed, going to those little kiosks that you could put money in. And so when the web came out, suddenly anybody could start their own publication. Anybody could then be published in Texas and be read all over the world, even in China. So it removed the geographic boundaries as well. It was so impressive that newspapers found a way, journalism disrupted by the web. They tried to find a new business model. Technology, journalism has been disrupted. What to do? And so for a while, they were kind of flailing around. So they had to compete now with the rest of the world. They had to compete with the rest of the world. And so what happened was that then all these sites that were built on Web 1.0 started to get big, like Facebook, like Twitter. And so they became the next gatekeepers. And so when you want to have a profile or a chat with people or have an event and go on Eventbrite, or you have, let's say, Facebook or Google or whatever, check out. You have to go through big tech companies again. The alternative to this was WordPress. It was like Magento and these things you could set up on your own server. You had a host that you could set it up. It was a free market, unlike these, which were essentially feudalism. And so that brings us to Web 3. Web 3, you had these things that could run on your own site and through your own MetaMask wallet, right? You could just sign into anything using this, which you could see with our websites here. Do this right here. Let me just show you. For example, you want to log in. You can log in with the wallet, right? With the wallet, and then the wallet comes up, and you simply sign something like, oh, I don't know. You sign, what is that? Oh, sorry. I don't know what it is. Whatever. You sign these little. It's not going to be good. Anyway, so you sign into these things through a wallet. I'll show you this later. So you own your identity, you own everything, you own the software, then the software runs on the blockchain. So for example, if you do Etherscan and you look at these smart contracts, like the ones we wrote, you'll see that in fact these smart contracts run on a blockchain. You can easily create them. This is by the people and for the people. But the HN, Hacker News, and the YC, the Y Combinators of the world, put out companies like OpenSea. OpenSea was funded again by the venture capital industry. Y Combinator, headquartered in New York. OpenSea leadership comes from Google and Palantir, Peter Thiel's thing, Lyft, Uber. Investors include Andreessen Horowitz and so on. And of course, they are a Y Combinator alum. Okay, Y Combinator was funded, team size 250. They moved to San Francisco, apparently. I don't know why it says New York, headquartered in New York, but moved to San Francisco, whatever. The point is, what does the venture capital industry do? They take something that's open source and decentralized, and again, make it centralized. So they basically say now that everything can run on our marketplace. You could sell it on our marketplace and give us a little cut as well. Look at that. So you got a bunch of volume, that's great, right? But again, all of this is, they don't even need the blockchain. It may as well just run in their personal little database, because all the wallets get the pictures from them, from OpenSea, pretty much, and all the prices from them, and they just hit their API. So like literally, they don't need to like inform the blockchain of anything. They could just run it here, and 90% of people wouldn't know the difference. That's what it means by centralized. If you want to break free of this, then Intercoin is what we're building. Anyway, so NFTs, fundraising on WeFunder, all of these sites, right? And kind of centralized also. The movement was to break free of the centralization. That is the alternative to big banks. I'll talk in another show about the solutions. But back to Peter Thiel. So Peter Thiel builds monopolies, advocates building monopolies, corrupts the youth, so to speak, from open source into extracting profits for Silicon Valley. Then what's interesting is this is the guy that started the run on the bank. This is the guy who said, okay, Clarion Capital, we got to get money out of this thing. The profit is the most important thing for him, right? He's got fiduciary responsibility to his LPs, but also he destroys the bank that has served the valley for so long. Now, never mind the fact that they all bank at the same bank, and never mind the fact that, you know, they're all very much herd animal, but starting a run on the bank could have massive implications down the line. And so you could say that, you know, if the bank's balance sheet was better, then it wouldn't have failed. But the fact is, every bank is insolvent by the way it's designed. So if you do enough of this, and if too much collusion happens, you see, then it destroys that bank. And then people start to think, well, what if other banks happen? This bank is unique. All the other ones like Silvergate, Signature Bank was closed because it was exposed to crypto. It wasn't actually insolvent, but New York State decided to execute its authority over that bank and pull its charter. So if you want banks that are chartered by governments and corporations, well, there you have it, and enjoy that system. But how well did that system work? Oversight of all these things, as opposed to DeFi. I hope these days you'd rather understand, instead of putting your money into FTX, which is a centralized app, a centralized exchange with a bunch of shadowy money and 100 different entities and no CFO, instead of trying to have your greed to take each other's money, how about investing in real DeFi? Things like Uniswap are much more reliable. I bet you a thought never occurred to you that Uniswap could suddenly take your money and abscond with it, right? Because it is a smart contract. And every one of these pools, NFTs or tokens, whatever you're trading, each one of these things comes out of a factory. And so it cannot be corrupted, because it's literally just a bunch of code that does what it does, and that's it. If you look at our code, each one of them comes out of a factory. Look at the factory, you can see this is code that you can use. You can literally just go and use it. It's open source, and we're going to be marketing this soon. So yes, you can literally come here or use one of our interfaces or use Etherscan or anything else. Just connect to Web3. And again, I'm not going to do it right now, but you connect through all of these wallets. You could do MetaMask, you could do whatever you want. And then you could go ahead and call methods like factory produce and give it a name, give it a symbol, right? You give it all these things, and it will in fact create for you a NFT smart contract, for example. So these are the alternatives. The alternative is a gift economy, an open source economy. If we as a society could just tamp down a little bit on the profit motive, the American dream of, is great. Having your house, that's great. But becoming a billionaire and extracting rents from people like Jeff Bezos and so on, maybe not so great. Maybe we should have better role models like Vitalik Buterin, like people who want to create open source software. So I'm almost done with the Peter Thiel saga. So Peter Thiel also had some wacky views when it comes to, he was outspoken, which I like, at least to his credit. He openly says what some people are afraid to say. And so one of the things he said, which I find to be super funny, is he says about women voting, Peter Thiel, women voting. He basically once wrote, and he kind of stands by it, he basically says, women getting the vote was bad for democracy. Actually, he said it was bad for capitalism. He basically said that since, women voted, and he's not against getting women to vote, he just says the consequences, they vote for more liberal, progressive economics. And he doesn't like those. He likes that the wealthy are able to trickle down the jobs, create more wealth, and so on, and so on. So basically, he uses the government sometimes to crush free speech, sometimes. But he published an essay where he talked about how it was a big blow. Why? I just want to be clear, because the vast increase in welfare beneficiaries, it's not a blow to democracy, it's a blow to capitalism. Welfare beneficiaries and the extended franchise to women, two constituencies that are notoriously tough for libertarians, of which he considers himself, have rendered the notion of capitalist democracy into an oxymoron, meaning most of the public electorate now, consisting also of women and people receiving welfare, now vote for more wealth redistribution, and he considers that to be a bad thing. Anyway, but he of course gets to sit on Facebook's board. He sits on many other boards. They sit on each other's boards, and they decide what to do. So if you want to live in that world, but have at it. Put all your money into banks, go to, be on TikTok and Twitter, and have the governments fight over whether to shut down TikTok. Or you could join the web 1.0 revolution. Stop relying on gatekeepers. Web 2.0 revolution. Where is it? It's not there. Qbix is the Web 2.0 revolution. Go to qbix.com if you want to see that. Control your own platform. Like WordPress, control your own thing. Where's the Web 3 revolution? I guarantee you it's not an OpenSea. It's not an FTX. It's not on all of these centralized things that essentially either go belly up or control your thing in their own database and just extract rents and keep you as a bunch of, no. You can control your own thing by going to intercoin.app and creating your own NFTs, your own DAOs, your own everything, not centralized at all. All right, that's the goal. That's the quiet revolution. So another time in the future, I'm going to talk about currencies. I'm going to talk about governments. I'm going to talk about banks, because of course, in other countries, things are far worse. The banking crisis hit Lebanon, okay, a while ago. People can't get money out. It's not a funny story. Sri Lanka ran out of money and ran out of fuel, and nobody could travel to work. It ran out of foreign reserves, okay? And Sri Lanka also ran out of fuel. Sri Lanka ran out of fuel and fuel. So like literally they can't get to work. What else? Haiti, unrest, runs out of fuel. Basically, fuels can only be afforded by the big, the people who can afford it, honestly. Not very cool. Okay, this is what's happening around the world. And we're looking to block shortages instead of governments making peace, as I've said, with Russia, making peace among Saudi Arabia and Iran, and letting, or at least for the last few decades, subsidizing electric power Why do you need fuel, by the way? Think about this for a second. Why do you need fuel? Why is there a monopoly on how cars are fueled? Well, it turns out that electric cars were killed by corporations again, and killed by government. Why? To maintain their profits, right? So Tesla, a lot of his research was killed by the fossil fuel industry. Battery research was terrible until finally Elon Musk started a company aptly called Tesla, after the great inventor who would have ushered in an electric car a long time ago. In fact, Edison had electric cars. Cars existed that could run on electricity a long time ago. He built a few electric cars and they're in the museum. Why? Because battery technology wasn't good enough. And why was battery technology not improved? Well, because of the fossil fuel subsidies, right? Because whenever OPEC increased the prices or whatever, which is another cartel, the US government decided to shield the fossil fuel prices from exactly the kind of thing that's happening in Haiti today. So by doing so, they also killed the electric car and other things as well. These corporations had electric cars, they're pretty good. You watch this documentary, it's pretty crazy. The electric cars worked, they ran everything. The company recalled them. They forced everyone to send it back and then turned them in a pile of scrap. Okay. So I think in this show, in this long show, I've shown a lot of how capitalism works together with government to preserve their profits, to not innovate, and to prevent innovation. The innovation is coming from decentralized bottom-up communities, as long as we're not captured by greed. If the industry is captured by greed, we're going to see a lot of Ponzi schemes, from Everrise and SafeMoon to something like, I don't know, Luna maybe, which they just look for the greater fool to put more and more money in. Look at this. You could look at essentially what Molly White is putting together here. Web3 is going just great. Every day there's more stuff, but most of this, what you see is either exploits and hacks or private keys. Or something is centralized. Something is centralized somewhere, including USDC, obviously, the banking industry. But then, the banking industry has a lot of these things, but others in the banking industry, you see. So while crypto is still tied to the banking industry and crypto still needs it as a gateway, right? Banking industry. So this is not really Web3, it's the banking industry causing it. But if you go back to previous things, you'll see centrally controlled bridges failing. Having a centrally controlled project, NFT project, rug pull, and so on. So what you want is decentralizing. And so all of these things, FTX collapse, central connect. Okay, so Celsius, Voyager, all of these were centrally controlled, as opposed to DeFi. Uniswap is not bankrupt, right? Aave Marketplace, not bankrupt. So, because they're DeFi, by the people, for the people. Do you see the difference? Do you see a difference between something like Wikipedia, which is by the people and for the people, turning out relatively balanced articles, relatively balanced, because any article has a talk page where they discuss what's good and what's bad and different things, require attribution, versus something like Twitter, where you own your audience and you love owning it, and you literally just engage in a lot of arguing and toxicity, because that's what sells, right? Negativity in news drives news. A study came out 3 days ago, negativity drives online news consumption, right? Online news consumption, which is again why I would like to do something to reform it with rational.app. All of our news is essentially going through publishers which need to bring in profits, so they need to have clickbait articles like so-and-so did this bad, and can you believe what that did, and outrage. On the other hand, and I interviewed Noam Chomsky about this and others, we have the social networks that are essentially brought before Congress, and they say, well, We make money
Fox San Antonio
on ads, and we need echo chambers because that's what we need the algorithm to produce engagement. What they fail to tell you is it selects for outrage. Here's top-down. This is what top-down control looks like. This is not freedom of speech. This is capitalism. Here you go.
Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities, the El Paso, Las Cruces communities, Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
Plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
Is this the world you want to live in? So this is top-down control. Next time, I'm going to talk about AI. Now imagine AI broadcasters. Imagine them being personalized to you and no longer saying the same script.
That's first.
Unfortunately,
Capitalism creates the corporation, which is a form of AI. It controls humans. The humans aren't telling you what they really think. They're telling you exactly what they're being told to. And if they don't say it, they're going to be replaced by someone who will. That's the point. They are employees. You're listening to employees. It's not just that Fox News admits that its hosts had talking points, or CNN admits in a lawsuit, or someone admits that they had talking points. It's that is how the whole system is run. So if you want to break free of the system and people have to inform each other, I'm not saying it will be perfect. I'm not saying there won't be other failure modes there, but at least there has to be some alternative. That's what Rational App is about. You could read that. So my point is, all of these platforms that we're now building, we have qbix here, and we have Intercoin here. And now we are building applications like Indeed, the teaching app, and the Rational app, and all of this to do what? Empower teachers to teach students without this top-down, no child left behind approach of public schools telling everyone what to do. And Rational app, without people informing each other, without necessarily the celebrities and personalities and top-down informing you, being told what to say. It's not genuine at all. Okay, they're making you sometimes radicalize so much that you'll support anything. You'll support the war, you'll support any war, you'll support their pollution, whatever it is, because you're too tired to fight because you have to work for a living. So that's what I mean. Government and industry distract us from solving systemic problems. The only way to opt out of this is to create a bottom-up movement, but somebody had to make the software. So we've made the platforms. Now we're finally putting out the applications. We're going to have NFT Remix coming out very soon. NFT Remix is going to help you create your own NFTs, start your own NFT collection without having to use OpenSea. You will own it, even if our company goes bankrupt, or even if you just want to be completely independent, you'll be able to. The smart contracts are on the blockchain. The interfaces will be on IPFS. You'll literally not depend on anything centralized at all. That's just the start. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you understand now that the tech industry is extremely centralized. They think competition is for losers. They want to build monopolies, many of them. Peter Thiele just says it out loud. They corrupt the open source guys into becoming this. We've never taken on VC until now. We've never done anything because honestly, VCs didn't like that we build these open source platforms. There's not much that they can do with this given to the people, just like WordPress. It takes a very special kind of VC to listen and accept this. And then, you know what? I want to talk about one of those types of VCs to end this, and that is Albert Wenger from Union Square Ventures. Unlike the people on the West Coast, people on the East Coast, including Albert Wenger, are very interesting because they, in fact, dedicated a lot of their life and speech to creating free speech and talking about the world after capital. So this is a venture capitalist talking about the world after capital. And so he creates a book that talks about, and it's freely given away, by the way, and he talks about digital technology. And so the main thing that he talks about is how there's a zero marginal cost to creating once a piece of information exists, it can be accessed from anywhere. And creating a new copy or modifying and improving actually doesn't take very much. So for example, Stable Diffusion, which is AI, once it was in the hands of the people, they improved it a lot. And similarly now, when we have the large language models, instead of OpenAI being actually closed, and Elon Musk wondering how come he gave $100 million to OpenAI, and then it became, he donated $100 million to OpenAI, and then he goes, it becomes a $30 million company for profit, and Microsoft gets way more than he ever did from this. You know what I mean? Look, I mean, you give it to the people, you don't have these issues. So the people, AI is the one area, I'll be honest, I'll have this in another video, where I'm a little skeptical that everyone should own it, just like I don't think people should own nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. I don't think people should own weapons of mass disinformation, because that's going to kill the web. That's the one area where it's, you know, I don't think also that people should own ways to do protein folding, because they could create all kinds of viruses. And I don't think people should have access to labs that can create these things. But that's what technology does over time. Technology empowers people to create good things, and a few people create bad things. It happens that it's very hard when those bad things virally spread. So hopefully that's not going to happen. But for everything else, open source is fantastic. So we've created these platforms, and now we're creating applications for them. So it's very rare VC that will actually publish this. And so Albert Wenger gets it, and Fred Wilson, and they run Union Square Ventures. I would say that Andreessen Horowitz gets it too. Mark Andreessen gave away the source of Netscape, and that's what led to all the open source Firefox and all this competition, which otherwise wouldn't happen. Their thesis, Union Square Ventures, happens to be, their thesis 3.0 happens to be what? Enabling trusted brands that broaden access to knowledge, capital, and well-being by leveraging networks, platforms, and protocols. Notice how this is much less of a centralized vision than build a monopoly, right? It's about platforms, networks of people coming together, and standard protocols. So this is what Peter Thiele says, right?
So if the monopolists pretend not to have monopolies, the non-monopolists pretend to have monopolies, the apparent difference is very small, whereas the real difference I would submit is actually quite big. And so there's this distortion that happens because of the lies people.
You could talk about this. And so he thinks that it's great sometimes to build a monopoly, whereas like I want to show you what finally what Fred Wilson says about Web3 and why he liked it. And I think Union Square Ventures might be something, a company hopefully still, that is interested in funding this ecosystem. Just be wary, because venture capitalists are not the only way to fund it anymore. We the people can fund it. We the people can have crowdfunding, which by the way, we're going to have here, we're going to have a crowdfund starting July 4th, Independence Day, in 100 days. You're very welcome to come and take a look. qbix, you could be part of it. You can buy shares in the company. So there's that. And of course, we could have a crowdfund of Intercoin right here on our own site, where you could go and buy. And we've already done this a couple of times. And we've done crowdfunding of Intercoin ITR tokens. We've got people all over the world actually using our
rotating the globe and exploring different countries.
All of our stuff here. So VCs is just one way to fund, but let's hear what Union Square Ventures has to say, and what Fred Wilson has to say about it. Give me 1 second, and I want to end on a positive note. And some VCs actually like the Web3 revolution, actually like, I hope they still do, the decentralized movement. So let me close these windows and we'll find the one that's not, that's the antithesis of Peter Thiele in some way. Here we go. Here we go.
And I'm just curious for you, what was the thing that struck you as different first?
Well, I always felt like money and value wasn't well integrated into the core internet infrastructure as it was built out in the late 80s and early 90s, and that it was missing. We had lots of stuff we got a lot of stuff right with HTTP and the web, but like money.
Say HTTP, open protocol. SMTP is the email protocol. Email, the web, they completely disrupted like government, post office, right? A lot of the gatekeepers at FedEx. Similarly with the web, I've said newspapers, magazines, radio shows. So like that's good stuff, but the money aspect and making it so that it's there's one copy of something, we needed blockchain, right? So this is what he talks about.
He got kludged onto it. It was like credit cards and PayPal, and it was all kind of just like a hack. And all of a sudden, to me, it was like, oh, this is the way you do value on the internet. Like this is like an internet-like architecture. It's distributed. No one owns it. It's open source. It's a protocol. It's decentralized. And so
that's the kind of thinking that I think is important. If you're just chasing profits and you extract value, don't get me wrong, a lot of people will opt into it. And libertarians around the world see this. It's nicer to live in a city with a big government and everything's taken care of for you. But the dark side of that is that you don't control anything. You don't have a free market. You don't have a choice of where to send your kids to school. You don't have a choice of doctor necessarily sometimes. And here, you don't have a choice of where to host with Facebook. Facebook, Google, they are the big states in cyberspace. They are the feudal lords. If you want to share a document, you go on Google Docs, or in this case, Notion, or Microsoft Office 360, right? And so given the power to the people is what these platforms are about. And now we're starting to build apps on them. So let's close it out. Fred Wilson on decentralization.
I don't know, it's just like, like I said, I've had a few epiphanies in my career, and that was one of them. I was just like, this is it. We found it.
So that's my show for today. I hope you understand everything I've spoken about, the collusion of the capitalists with the, I should say the corporatists, the corporations with the government. It just happens that in a free market, it could be that a corporation may in fact get all the major innovations, because forget patents for a moment. If they have all the equipment, they can hire all the best people. They can run a loss for a long time, giving stuff away. If the venture capitalist industry allows these startups, plows money in them to reduce friction, to create these unit economics, money-losing economics. For a long time, that happened, and they fed it to this large conglomerate of either a unicorn IPO that's owned by the public or by big tech, acqui-hire. But either way, what happens is that the people running this company are then pushed to extract profit from the two sides of the marketplace, sometimes a three-sided marketplace with advertising and so on. But like there's a marketplace, let's say drivers and passengers, right? So Uber gets in there and it needs to take 50% of all the drivers' money. Why? Well, the shareholders bought the stock at 100. They want it to go to 200. They don't want it to go down. So like the shareholder class perpetually buys the stock. Selling stock gets you into this ecosystem where the people who bought the stock would like to see the value of the shares go up. Well, there might be something to be said about paying them out, giving them the dividends, and gradually tapering off. And maybe the stock can become utility tokens, right? Can be traded for utility tokens or whatever. But at the end of the day, the difference is utility tokens can be only used once for the utility. When Vitalik sold his Ethereum, that Ethereum was used for gas fees or something else once. When I buy a book, I can read that book, I can sell it to someone else, okay? But if Vitalik had sold shares in Ethereum Inc., okay, well, what happened is that the shareholders got to be very careful because they want profits. And don't get me wrong, by betting early, by getting in early, they can definitely make profits. But if you perpetually make a market where they sell to other people the shares, and then those people sell to other people the shares, you create a class of people, the shareholders, who continually push Facebook to extract rents from its ecosystem. And when its shares drop 70% because it's trying to make a metaverse or some other innovation, well, that's considered a bad thing, because now look at the shares of Facebook. It's not going to make profits anymore. So corporate profits and the corporation as an institution, it's one way to drive the economy forward, but it has a lot of downsides. And what Fred Wilson just talked about, what he saw the epiphany of, is code that is not self-interested. It is not a corporation. It's a new kind of institution, which is smart contracts. And if those smart contracts can help us self-organize and create these instances of Uniswap pools or Aave pools, or the 12 different applications of Intercoin in all these different ways that you can create on top of it, you could create innovation just like we've done on the web. It has unleashed trillions of dollars of self-expression. It is in fact what is fed into ChatGPT, and what gives it all that intelligence is all of that published that is searchable, indexable, and openly available on the web. So I'd like to see more projects like Wikipedia, like Linux, and like, for example, Ethereum and many other open source projects, because these are the things that give people a more balanced view. They inform people. They give them the software that they can use to run, right? Stable diffusion. This is the future. It's power to the people. The people can run it on their own computers. They don't have to wait for OpenAI or others to do it. Like I said, it could get dangerous if you start putting weapons into the hands of people, stuff that could be done at scale. I don't like when people do it at scale. Because then they become the net, it could be even worse than a corporation. They could become a virus or some sort of, like AstroTurf with 1 million bots, like a bunch of stuff. What I'm saying is open source that lets small villages, small communities, small businesses serve their members, serve their constituents, serve each other. That's what I would like to see. So, I agree that open source can be misused in some of these cases, and I'm worried about that. But by and large, I think when it comes to having a local contest or a local dating site or a local whatever, we don't need large corporations like Facebook, indeed like the venture capital industry puts together, to have that software in their own server farms and only give us the interface to it. We need to have the actual backend software running on our computers in our village, with fast internet locally, so that we can date each other, we can meet each other, we can plan dinners together, we can do all the things that people did for hundreds and thousands of years locally without having to rely on these giant corporations. So that's the vision. I've built the software, and now we're going to market with the applications. Frankly, the applications will probably get VC funding, and they're going to love the meteoric rise of this and that application. But at the end of the day, the platforms have to become and remain open and free. That is the only way that we, the people, will be able to run the applications locally on our computers, and that's the only way we can serve each other and be free. Well, thank you for listening, and hopefully tune in again for another informative talk by me, Greg Magershak. Thank you very much. Like to be the first to hear about Intercoin's roadmap and news? Definitely join and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to click that little notification button so you can get updates when the next video drops and the next time we interview a legend like Noam Chomsky or Patrick Friedman. And if you would like to participate in the conversation, go to community.intercoin.app. We'd love to hear from you and about your community. This is what the project is all about. Intercoin, bringing power to the people.